James Bond.
What are some of your favorite films of all time? Are they some of the more well-known popular choices, or more art-housey, lesser-known projects? Are they your favorites because you think they represent the best in cinema, or because you have a deeply personal connection with them? In case you weren't aware, I've often described Casino Royale from 2006 as my favorite film in the James Bond series. That doesn't mean I think it's necessarily the objective best, whatever that means, but it is the one that means the most to me, the one I've had the best time watching, the one that makes me think the most, and the one I've never left without being impressed. So the task of reviewing it is daunting, as I know I will fail to properly justify with every viewer why I put it above every other film in the series. Knowing that means it goes above the early Connery films, GoldenEye, and The Spy Who Loved Me, I know how bold of a claim this is to make. So let me dispel some easy, cynical claims up front. No, this was not my first Bond film ever. I had seen all the previous ones and read most of the Fleming books about a year before this film's release, though this was the first film to come out after I became a fan. Daniel Craig is not my favorite Bond. This is the only film of his that's in my top 10 of the series, the rest being mostly before Brosnan. Most of my favorite films ever made are well over 30 years old, so I don't think I have much of an inherent bias towards newer films, though Casino Royale is now 18 years old, so it's hardly new. And I don't think this film is virtually flawless. I do have a few things to criticize, and they aren't all nitpicks. Regardless of all of that, I'm proud to be a huge fan of this one, and it's the only Bond film in my personal top 10 favorite films of all time. The production history of this film is incredible, and I very easily could make an entire other video covering what led up to it and the actual making of it. But for now, I'll just cover the broad strokes after 1967, since I already covered part of this history in 2 previous reviews. Some of the rights to Casino Royale, one of only 2 Fleming original novels that were not signed over to Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, went over to Columbia Pictures after Charles K. Feldman's death, with the rest going to United Artists. Columbia went through some tumultuous times in the years following, with it eventually ending up in the hands of Sony in 1989. In October 1997, Sony announced it had signed a deal with Kevin McClory, the man holding the screen rights to Thunderball. The implication was that the studio could make its own rival series of Bond films. MGM hit back with a lawsuit, which got very messy, with certain allegations even being made that Kevin was owed profits on all of the previous films due to his role in creating the cinematic Bond. Weirdly, what ended up being the thing that settled the dispute was Spider-Man. MGM owned some of the rights to that character, and a compromise was reached. MGM would give up those rights in exchange for Sony relinquishing its claims to the Bond character. As a result, Eon and MGM finally reacquired the rights to Casino Royale. After the commercially successful but critically lukewarm Die Another Day, Eon tried to figure out how to move forward. The problem they kept running into was that trying to top Die Another Day would likely end up making the series even more outlandish and closer to science fiction than they wanted to go. With the success of films like The Bourne Identity, the thought was to take it back down to something more character-driven and low-key. The original plan was to do a spin-off with Halle Berry's Jinx, but for several reasons that didn't end up happening. Finally, it was suggested just to do Casino Royale, and everybody felt that was the right move. The question became what to do with Pierce Brosnan. His 4 films had been successful at the box office, more so than any of the other actors. But if the producers were going to adapt Casino Royale faithfully, it meant the character had to be at the start of his career, and the prospect of a reboot rules out Pierce. Despite drafts being written trying to work him into the part again, the producers made the difficult decision to let Brosnan go and find someone new. Whatever my personal feelings are on Pierce and how this was handled, the move does make creative sense to me. The search began anew, with so many actors being touted up. I remember people like Clive Owen, Hugh Jackman, Ewan McGregor, Julian McMahon, Orlando Bloom, and Goran Vishnik all being rumored for the part, with several wonderful actors being confirmed to have been on the shortlist like David Tennant and Henry Cavill. But on October 14th, 2005, a press conference was held to announce the 6th James Bond, Daniel Craig. I was as surprised as anyone. I had only seen one of his films by that point, the original Tomb Raider, so I quickly went out and found some of his other movies like Road to Perdition and Layer Cake. While I couldn't see Craig as a more traditional Bond, he was an interesting actor, and I took a wait-and-see approach. However, many were quick to voice their disappointment, with websites like the still-up-and-running DanielCraigIsNotBond.com, and especially in the forums I frequented at the time like CommanderBond.net. Despite this, the producers had full confidence in their choice, and most of the rest of the cast and crew, including several previous Bond actors, voiced their approval of Craig. So production continued forward. Martin Campbell, the director of GoldenEye, was finally enticed to come back to the series with the challenge of making a whole new kind of Bond film. The cast featured some terrific names like Mads Mikkelsen, Jeffrey Wright, and Eva Green, with a surprise return of Judi Dench. And the time and tested crew from the Brosnan films all came back, including Peter Lamont, David Arnold, Daniel Kleinman, and the writing duo of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, though they were joined this time by Paul Haggis. Despite the constant scrutiny of the tabloids, the production went fine, though MGM was notably making a Bond film jointly with Columbia Pictures, an odd twist of fate given the studio's history with Bond and this story in particular. And Casino Royale was released to the world in November 2006 and proved a success beyond most of the world's expectations. A newly minted 00 agent, James Bond is sent out to discover how an entire network of terrorists is financed. His mission takes him to Madagascar, where he tails a freelance bomb maker. After a chase through a construction yard and into an embassy, Bond ends up killing the man and escaping with his cell phone. He reads the last message received and traces it to the Bahamas, but also receives a stern warning from M about his short-sighted actions. Bond finds out the man who hired the bomb maker was Alex Dimitrios, a known associate of Le Chiffre, who is involved in a scheme to blow up a new airliner in order to make a profit in the stock market. Bond foils this plan, leaving Le Chiffre in a financial bind and having to organize a high-stakes poker game in order to raise funds. Bond is inserted into the game and is accompanied by Vesper, an IC officer from the Treasury who provides him the money. Bond soon finds that he is playing the game of his life, with the stakes being a lot higher than the $100 million on the table. There are few topics in film today that are more controversial than reboots, and I think it's mainly down to the fact that there have been so many of them. Several franchises have now had not just one, but multiple. For example, Spider-Man has had 2 live-action reboots so far, and depending on how you count, Batman has had 4, with a 5th in the coming years. Reboots are an attractive idea for studios because it represents a great compromise. The artists involved get some creative license they may not have had otherwise, and the studio already has a built-in audience for the film. The problem of originality in Hollywood has long been a standing issue, due to the fact that it's rare for an original property to compete with an established one, and the studios are businesses first, trying to increase their profits every year. So the current mentality seems to be that reboots are a more safe way to secure those dollars. It has indeed become an oversaturated and dated notion now, but there are still reboots that do well and are done with properties that, quite frankly, need them. The other issue I see brought up with reboots is that its implications are that the previous version was garbage and not worth salvaging. And for an invested fan base, few things hurt more than to see something you love tossed aside and transformed into something lesser. I can sympathize with that mindset, but I also understand that these things can't last forever without some changes. James Bond, like any character, is a product. A beloved one, but a product nonetheless, and products change over time. If they don't, then they become obsolete and are thrown away. I would argue that too much reverence for earlier versions stifles creativity and relegates things to be forever stuck in the past. As long as those earlier versions are allowed to be experienced by the general public in some easily accessible way, I have no qualms with new versions of the characters, from the slightly modified to the radical departures. It's with taking chances that we find new versions that we love and that can be just as valid. As much as I love the original Star Trek cast and their stories, I'm so glad we got things like The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. While I'll always prefer a Lara Croft more akin to the original, I welcome the new games wholeheartedly and regularly replay them. Sure, you're bound to end up with subpar versions of properties with all these reboots out there, but I'm not fundamentally against the idea, and if I like the product, even if I prefer the earlier stuff, I'll champion its merits. Daniel Craig's James Bond is a re-examination of Ian Fleming's original creation. It is drastically different to the traditional cinematic Bond we get in films like Goldfinger and GoldenEye in a lot of ways, but the heart of the character is still intact. He is a professional, he enjoys refined society, he enjoys women, he's got style up the wazoo, and he finds a way to not let the work corrupt his soul. He is still a hero, though sometimes bordering on anti-hero status, and I admire his strength and willpower to get through the grueling work. Where Craig differs from his predecessors is in an emphasis on the emotional journey. There has always been shades of this with the other actors, particularly Timothy Dalton, but Casino Royale makes it clear that we are going to treat this man going forward as an actual human being, one who can bleed, one who can be hurt, and one that grows over time. It does take away from some of the unique standalone escapism of the earlier films, and it does mean the fun is going to be presented with a different flavor, but I think this is just as valid a take on the character. The Fleming books were certainly about an evolving man. The man who we see at the beginning of Casino Royale is not the same that we leave off with in The Man with the Golden Gun. It's in the films where the character largely became the same from entry to entry. You can drop a total newbie into the living daylights and then show them Thunderball, and other than adjusting to a different actor in a different time, I doubt they're going to have much of an issue with it. With Craig, it makes the most sense to start with Royale and then progress chronologically. Some fans resist this, as the Bond series has always been fairly unique in how the main character remained remarkably relevant over the years without drastic adjustments, and I admire that too. I just don't think it means that we should never try something different with Bond, as that reverence for the earlier versions can often become akin to an unhealthy dogmatism that few characters in fiction are afforded. Craig had to win us all over with his portrayal, and I'm still amazed how convincingly he makes his case within the first few minutes. To me, he is still identifiable as a version of James Bond, and I find this to be a fascinating take. In Royale, he is definitely still a professional that has had years of experience, but the job is done in an unrefined manner, and Bond is more reactionary than thoughtful. The exchanges he has with both M and Vesper throughout the film illustrate this beautifully. M calls Bond a blunt instrument, and that's a perfect description for the character. He does his work with such straightforward single-mindedness without considering the larger ramifications. He barrels through a construction site, breaking through walls and destroying equipment. He walks right into an embassy, violating international laws, and while he doesn't kill anyone until the end, he's assaulting government officials and resisting the security forces. And he kills his only lead on camera, compromising the British government and its investigation. This is a film where Bond's actions are called into question, and while I can sympathize in the moment why Bond did things the way he did, I'm fully on M's side that he needs to prove himself an individual to be trusted with that kind of responsibility and be worthy of the 00 status he was so recently granted. The film is a character study of James Bond, and one of the major themes running throughout is the big picture. Our actions are always done inside of a larger context, going both forward and backward, and living each day like it's your last in the name of duty is a reckless tactic. You need to keep in mind the larger forces at play and understand that in this line of business, you are a piece on a chessboard, or a chip in a poker game. The moves made with you should be calculated, and you do not automatically win because you are the hero in your own story. In the novel, this was a central theme, with Le Chiffre equating their situation to a game of Red Indians. Here, the visual imagery of poker serves the same purpose, a way to illustrate the larger game Bond will play with both Le Chiffre during the torture scene and the organization afterwards. Bond eventually learns the lesson here, by learning to be more careful with Le Chiffre during the game over time, by having Mathis taken into custody, and finally by not throwing away everything about Vesper. At the end, when he conveys how final the betrayal feels to him with M, he says, "The bitch is dead." M implores Bond to remember that Vesper must have had some love for him. It could not have all been an act. He thinks on that and decides to check Vesper's phone for a lead. He is then rewarded with a virtual message from beyond the grave, giving him the info he needs to track down Mr. White. Confined within this one film, I think this arc is done remarkably well. Obviously, when you add in the later films, they do complicate it a bit, but I'll leave out those discussions for another time. With this film following in the footsteps of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, both in adapting a source novel fairly faithfully and by placing a new, more human version of Bond at the forefront, the filmmakers do something extraordinary. Win us over on an actor few were ecstatic about. Daniel Craig makes an astonishing debut, and immediately I was forced to go home and reconcile the fact that he's won me over on a new version of the character I already thought was pretty definitively played by past actors. This is a matter of personal taste, and Craig is still receiving some pretty loud backlash from certain fans to this day, but Daniel made me realize how little some of my preconceptions about the character mattered. He didn't have to have dark hair or be classically handsome for me to identify him as Bond, and the film didn't have to end with him in bed with the woman or even necessarily winning the war. The series and the character can be more versatile than that, and it doesn't have to be the same. Craig still has his moments where he reminds me of classic Bond. He's got as much style as any of the other guys. He looks great in the action scenes, he's wonderfully reserved and confident when he needs to be, but his armor does crack and you can occasionally see the more vulnerable man inside. And my goodness, he can be funny. Craig's Bond has been criticized for being too moody, and while I can generally agree with that, the man does know how to deliver understated comedy. I wouldn't call Royale the funniest in the series, but it contains some of the biggest laugh-out-loud moments in the series for me. Him throwing the gun back at Malaka's face, the first dinner scene with Vesper, the Stephanie Broadchest line, the angry request for a martini, and the torture scene. It's all great stuff. But I think his best moments are outside of the comedy. His performance during that torture scene is wonderful, especially the look of fear he has on his face for just a moment. His rapport with M in those scenes is also of note. He never seems disrespectful of M in those moments, and he is internalizing everything she is saying. He'll still defend his actions, but it never comes across as insubordination. And his delivery of that final line makes the last scene perhaps the most, pardon my French, kick-ass ending I've seen in a Bond film. But it's in his performances with Eva Green where he most earns his accolades, and it helps that she's delivering an equally great performance too. Their banter is filled with great timing and inflection so that you can always feel the development of the relationship progress underneath. From laughing at their barbed wire jabs to feeling their growing affection with each other, this is a relationship that just works. To me, it is rivaled in this series only by Bond and Tracy in Majesties. Yet it feels like that relationship was updated to include the chemistry of someone like Bond and Pussy Galore and Goldfinger. While I think you could make a strong case for Tracy being the best Bond woman of the series, I respectfully put forth Eva Green as a contender for that honor. Not only is there this relationship, but you can always see there's something more driving her that she keeps buried underneath, and there are moments where you can see her wrestle with her own mission's needs versus her growing affection for Bond, such as when Mendel comes to transfer the money, or during Bond's conversation about the tell on the beach. The best scene with them is in the shower. Vesper is in shock after witnessing death firsthand, and instead of talking much, Bond comes in to comfort her and offers a shoulder to cry on. He is empathetic towards this reaction, probably because he too had to take a breath after killing someone. This is the first real moment of vulnerability between the two characters, starting them down on the path towards love. Both Craig and Eva Green shine in this film, and it's one of the few times I truly believe Bond thought of a woman as not a disposable pleasure, but a meaningful pursuit, which is my favorite line in the film, by the way. All of this culminates in a death scene that hits me hard, when Vesper commits suicide and I have to watch Bond desperately try to save her. He shows fear, rage, contemplation, and heartbreak in a matter of seconds, and it's some of Craig's best acting in the film. It's one of the only times in this series I've been moved enough to tears, and even during my most recent viewing, that scene still got me. If all this film had was Craig's and Green's performances, it'd still be a solid flick in that area. But you have Mads Mikkelsen and Judi Dench to contend with. This was my first introduction to Mikkelsen, and right away I could tell he was an actor I had to see more of. We've seen him in many Hollywood productions since, and while he's consistently been excellent in everything I've seen him in, I still think this is some of his best acting in a mainstream film. Jury's out when you incorporate some of his roles like A Royal Affair and The Promised Land. Le Chiffre is a great darker side of Bond character, and that was important to nail here since that was what the character was in the book. A player in a larger organization that operates with a bit of autonomy but still reports to higher masters, and is fiercely intelligent, ruthless, and has a high standard of living, Le Chiffre serves as an object lesson for Bond. He's not invincible, as he sometimes acts, and there's always the danger that he will die ignominiously in the dirt, forgotten by the world. There is somewhat of a parallel that can be made between Le Chiffre's death and Bond's eventual death, if you wish. Le Chiffre is more than he appears to be, and when I did my villains ranking video, I figured he wouldn't go too high. However, when I considered the character amongst all the others, I found that he competed well, and I've grown to admire him more and more as time goes by. Judi Dench's return as M was a welcome treat. Nobody expected her to come back when it was made clear that Royale was going to reboot the series, but I agree with Martin Campbell's thought process. She's too perfect to be tossed aside without consideration. Much like how virtually everyone else changed from License to Kill to GoldenEye, but the producers felt it would be wrong not to have Desmond Llewellyn back as Q, Judi makes so much sense to keep on. Plus, she makes a clear difference between her M in the Brosnan films and her M here. M rarely ever had a part to play in the story, but here she serves as the voice of reason for Bond. Her scenes are pivotal points in Bond's story. He always comes away with a lesson to learn when he speaks to her one-on-one, and having a masterclass actress like Dench does a lot to elevate these scenes. I should talk briefly about Mathis, Solange, and Felix Leiter. I've always been a fan of Mathis from the books, and I'm so glad he finally made a film appearance. I did wonder why he never showed up before, but then I remembered that earlier films didn't include large roles for French agents, and I would have been really ticked off if they brought in Mathis to fulfill a role like Aubergine. Giancarlo Giannini brings a lot of charm to the part and plays the character just as I imagined him. He makes for one of my favorite allies in the series. Solange is a fairly standard secondary Bond woman, though she's much like Domino or Lupe in that she's trapped in a loveless relationship. She seeks excitement where she can, and it's quite tragic she's killed off in the way that she is. Jeffrey Wright is an inspired choice for Felix Leiter. Felix did originally appear in the novel, and so it was cool to see him here because we had not seen him at all during the Brosnan films. Much like Bond, Leiter has a bit of a journey throughout the Craig era, and I'll talk about him in each of the entries that he shows up in, but even though Bond and Leiter don't have much time together here, I instantly buy a friendship between them and was excited at the time at the prospect of seeing them together in future films. The crew are all operating on top form. What's interesting is that whenever a stylistic change in the series happens like this, the crew is largely the same from the last film, and while the focus is placed on different areas in the script, the productions often feel similar to each other. I could easily believe that the same team made both Majesty's Secret Service and Diamonds Are Forever, or Moonraker and For Your Eyes Only. Here, it's hard to picture the same crew from Die Another Day, and I think that's because everyone went in taking advantage of the creative freedom here. Royale doesn't even feel like it's from the same series as Die Another Day, or even GoldenEye. Peter Lamont was the production designer on all three, but the sensibilities do feel different from film to film. Daniel Kleinman did the titles for all three, but they feel unique. Phil Mayhew did the photography for both GoldenEye and Royale, but they do not have the same visual language or color correction. Neil Purvis and Robert Wade largely wrote both Day and Royale, but one feels a lot smarter than the other. Martin Campbell directed both GoldenEye and Royale, but it doesn't feel like it. The only one who falls out of sync with this pattern is David Arnold. Don't get me wrong, I adore this score and think that alongside Tomorrow Never Dies, this is his finest work in the series. But he does use some electronic elements in the Miami International Airport scene, and at times it does remind me of Die Another Day. Thankfully, Arnold pulls back on the electronics, making them a supplement to the orchestra and not an equal partner. This music feels polished and deliberate. He comes up with original themes and motifs and uses them throughout. His Vesper theme is perhaps his best contribution to the series alongside the Surrender track from Tomorrow's End credits. The investigation scene from M's apartment and the CCTV room has the same melody behind them. The City of Lovers has a great motif underscoring it. But perhaps the most notable creative choice is the relative absence of the James Bond theme. Arnold thought including the full theme within the film meant that the score was getting ahead of the story, saying Craig has earned his stripes as Bond before the story lets him. So he comes up with a few compromises. There are select places where the 4-note progression will play, often signaling when Bond has gained a piece of the armor set. The car, the tux, cheating death, fighting back the bad guys. There is a musical substitute for the Bond theme in the form of the title song, which carries a lot of the action scenes and sweeping establishing shots, and the orchestra will play the Bond theme in full glory at the end. It is truly an explosion of excitement when we finally hear it. What's great about it is that it ramps up to the main theme. It doesn't just arrive, there's a lead in, and our excitement goes up at the same rate. The later Craig films did try to replicate this minimalist approach, but it never quite worked as well, and it never made as much sense creatively as it does here. About that title song, David Arnold made a wise choice here. We could have had yet another seductive, velvety colored song, and that would have been welcome after Madonna's offering in the last film, but Arnold felt this film needed to follow Craig's journey. This is a more youthful, arrogant Bond who bursts in without much thought. So he puts together a rock track with one of the finest vocalists of the time, Chris Cornell. I grew up in the Puget Sound area of Washington State, so I already knew Cornell's voice from Soundgarden and Audioslave. I was surprised how well his voice matched this style of Bond, and I think it was a shame this is one of two Craig songs that didn't get at least an Oscar nod. Pair it with one of the more unique title sequences of the series, and You Know My Name leaves a big impression. It remains my favorite of the series, with Only Diamonds Are Forever rivaling it. Now that I've hopefully given you a taste of how much I love this film, let's move on to some of the problems I have and a few that others often point out. I've seen a lot of people criticize the gambling scenes. There's the easy remark that such a focus of a card game feels out of place within an action film, but there's so much tension in those scenes for me. As Bond says, it's not about the cards, it's about playing the man across from you. And these scenes are a fabulous way of subtly building the relationship between Bond and Le Chiffre and revealing more about their characters. That said, the actual card playing itself gets criticized a lot by people more immersed in the game. I did read up on Texas Hold'em before the film came out, so I understood the various hands and had a vague notion of how rare certain combinations were. But I've seen comments ranging from how the dealers conduct the game, which is ironic because both of them were professional dealers, to how ridiculously low the odds were that the hands appear as we see them. To that end, I can only wave the flag of artistic license. Films take creative liberties often to facilitate story points and scenes. It's like a sleight of hand magic trick. When played with in moderation and with gambles that aren't too high, most audiences won't notice or care. However, if the entire story rests on give-me's and plot contrivances, the audience won't buy it. Being versed in the audio world, the instant cleanup of audio in detective stories always bugs me because it happens way faster and comes out cleaner than most professionals can manage. But I go along with it, and I understand that most people don't know enough about the field to cry foul on it. Same with the poker scenes here. I'm too much of a neophyte player to notice these kinds of mistakes, but I'm also not seeing much here that would destroy a regular person's immersion that only had a passing knowledge of the game. Though I do have to ask, can a person fold during a two-person showdown? I praised the scenes between Bond and Vesper over dinners as they read each other, as their chemistry is excellent and I can easily follow their train of logic. However, some have criticized Bond's reading of Vesper on the train, not because it's wrong, but because it's pretty basic and surface level coming from a supposed expert. I do think that's a valid complaint, and it slightly bugs me. Especially since Le Chiffre is a master poker player, I feel like he should be able to prevent Bond from reading him at all if this is the kind of analysis Bond can offer. I also don't think we get enough of a sense of the passage of time between Vesper and Bond starting the relationship and the end of it. It's not that I don't buy into the emotions of the moment, but when I take a step back and see how deeply she affected Bond, especially when you add in the later movies, I think it's too short. I don't want the movie to spend any more time focusing on it, but I wish there was one line about how they've spent a few weeks or a few months with each other. Speaking of length, the movie does start to run a bit long. I've usually had friends ask when we've seen the transition from Bond on the boat to Mr. White's car, how long is the film? But that complaint instantly goes away when they realize it's the final scene. I'm not sure how to fix it, but it's something I've noticed as well. A few more minor things to point out. Given that there is such a long stretch of time between his first scene and when he reappears on the barge to kill Le Chiffre, it took me a few viewings before I connected the dots that this was Mr. White who appears there. In the car chase, we see Bond going pretty fast to catch up with Le Chiffre and his men. Would they have had enough time to stop, put Vesper out on the road, and drive away before Bond catches up? The timestamp on the phone message that Bond uses to find Demetrios is exactly the same as the message sent to the phone number that Bond uses to find Carlos. Does Demetrios just always send that message out at that time of night? I wish the numbers that Bond types out for the password match the ones that Vesper does later. Bond's line about the caviar for one before he leaves Solange is strange to me. Does he just sleep with her and they share a small amount of caviar? If so, wasn't Bond in a hurry to catch the flight to Miami to follow Demetrios? I'm wondering if this wasn't done this way because it sounds like a dramatic last line before a quick cut to the Aston Martin acting as a transition emphasis. Lastly, I wanted to clear up something that people have expressed confusion over. When Vesper receives the text that Mathis needs her, Bond lets her leave, thinks for a minute, and then says Mathis before he gets up and runs after her. It's not very clear why Bond thinks anything is wrong, but there is an explanation in the novel. Bond reasons that Mathis wouldn't have left him out of anything he had to say to Vesper, and likely would have even entered the dining hall in his pajamas. So this tips Bond off that something is wrong. There are still plenty of things I could go into, such as the opening scene, the titles themselves, the differences between the book and the film and where the film improves on the book, the theme of betrayal, how well staged the action is, how the film both respects and critiques the earlier films, and so on. But suffice to say, for the sake of keeping this video at a more manageable length, this is one of the richest films in the series. No film is perfect, though some manage to convince you they are when you're watching them. As cliché as it sounds, Casino Royale is one of the most important and best films in the series. If you had to pick a few films to introduce new people to the series, or pick a Mount Rushmore of films, I'm in complete agreement with others that this belongs up there with the likes of Goldfinger, The Spy Who Loved Me, and GoldenEye in those camps. Casino Royale not only shows there's more to explore with James Bond than anyone thought possible, it demonstrated that Bond could compete with other action films and even show them up. Many people today may be dismissive of the series as a whole, claiming it to be antiquated, too willing to rely on a formula, and something that should be left in the bins of history. To that I say, have you seen the Mount Rushmore of Bond films? Every so often, a film comes along and reaffirms the specialness of James Bond as a franchise. They might not be everyone's favorites, but the good they did for the series is hard to dismiss. Casino Royale is a monument within the series. It cemented 007's place once again with a doubtful public and brought in a load of new fans. I wasn't among them, but I did see an influx of people talking about this film casually for months or years later. People who I personally knew had never seen a Bond film before. And it was wonderful. James Bond was back, looking and feeling better than he had in a long time, and the future seemed bright with possibilities. But as is so often the case, reality sets in, and that future we once hoped for proves too good to be true. Not that the future we got was all bad, but perhaps it was inevitable that the following film could never have lived up to that hype. Add to that a writer's strike, and perhaps Quantum of Solace was a doomed proposition from the start.
I was always very interested to meet you. I heard so much about you from Vesper.
Iron Man, Casablanca, Jaws, Lawrence of Arabia, This is Spinal Tap, and Sunset Boulevard. Beyond being great movies, these are productions that started without finished scripts. It's almost a rule in Hollywood that you don't do this, yet we have many examples of good films that did just this. Their productions were often filled with frustrations, delays, and panic, but art can come from adversity, and in these cases you had many talented people that came together to create something great. The James Bond series has had a few examples of films that had unfinished scripts, or ones that were heavily changed throughout production. Tomorrow Never Dies is surprisingly cohesive and a solid action flick despite having a nightmarish production. Never Say Never Again certainly had script issues, and while I'm not an especially big fan of that film, it does have its merits and it does its best to cover its troublesome production from the audience. So starting Quantum of Solace without a finished script wasn't necessarily an omen that spelled doom for the project, but that was not the only problem it had to overcome. There was the direction for it to be a part 2 to Casino Royale's story, hiring a director with an unfamiliarity of the Bond series, a writer's strike, a studio-mandated release date that was only 18 months after its predecessor, though that eventually was shifted to 24 months, and the incredibly high expectations Royale had created for its follow-up. While I do think Quantum squanders a lot of its opportunities and fascinating ideas, I consider it a miracle the thing isn't a train wreck on the level of some of the 80s canon films and is even watchable. Even before Casino Royale had released, work had started on Bond 22. Sony was pretty happy with what they were seeing and they wanted to film out by May 2008. Roger Mitchell was being courted to direct, and the writing trio of Neil Purvis, Robert Wade, and Paul Haggis were all brought back to pen the script. However, progress was slow due to many factors, and Mitchell departed from the picture. This caused enough consternation that the release date was pushed 6 months back to November 2008. But then, an unexpected crisis came upon the team: a writer's strike. Paul Haggis literally finished his second draft of the screenplay 2 hours before the strike commenced, so there was no chance of hiring more guild members to come in and give it more of a polish. So the job of writing essentially fell to the creative team, including the director, Mark Forster, and Daniel Craig. Forster is not a fan of the series and was only known for smaller dramatic pieces, and Craig, however talented he may be, admits he's not a writer. But with the pressure of the release date upon them, the producers felt that if they didn't start now, the film might never get off the ground. Quantum surprisingly was delivered on time, though compromises had to be made, especially in the post-production phase, and the reaction was a tepid acceptance by audiences. It didn't exactly bomb, but most everyone said the same thing: the first was better. James Bond brings a captive Mr. White to an MI6 safe house in Siena. M participates in the interrogation, trying to discover more about the shadowy organization behind Le Chiffre and Vesper. Mr. White clues them into how pervasive the organization really is, with M's personal bodyguard Mitchell even being among their numbers. Bond chases after Mitchell after he fails to kill M, but Mitchell himself is killed during the chase. With little to go on, MI6 turns their attention to another branch of the investigation, provided by tagged bills in Le Chiffre's money laundering operation. Bond follows the money to Haiti, where he soon finds a high-ranking member of the organization, Dominic Green, is planning a coup of Bolivia with an exiled General Medrano. Bond also meets Green's girlfriend, Camille, who definitely has her own motivations against Green and Medrano. 007 must discover how deep this organization goes and prevent them from launching a scheme that threatens to upset the balance of power, while also grappling with the personal ramifications of the death of Vesper, making sure he doesn't lose his own soul in the process. Being a continuation of a previous film can be tricky, especially when that film is a fairly complete tale. Obviously, there can be more to the story after the happily ever after in a fairy tale, but you have to ask yourself if that story is worth telling. In this case, Bond dealing with the aftermath of Vesper's death is an intriguing notion, but it's not a story in of itself, at least not one that would fit the expectations that come with a Bond film. Audiences want to see Bond foil a bad guy's plan with some solid action. So how do you tie that into the notion that Bond needs some closure? The obvious answer would be to do a story about vengeance. Quantum takes an interesting spin on this. Bond isn't out for revenge, he's doing a more traditional assignment against the same organization behind Le Chiffre and Vesper, but his actions seem coated with a rage that is uncharacteristic of a professional. Thus the idea of M's shaken trust in Bond and the manhunt motivated by corrupt officials. So Quantum isn't really a revenge tale. It comes off more as a story about Bond foiling another bad guy from the same organization, and oh by the way, he gets a Quantum of Solace at the end. I'm split on this. On the one hand, I love that Bond is putting his job before his heart's desires. That's classic Bond in a great way. A lot of the earlier films portrayed him as such because it was easier to have an emotionally stagnant Bond in a series of mostly standalone adventures. But GoldenEye made this notion a central part of Bond's journey there. He chooses the mission over Trevelyan despite his personal history. And the end of this film has Bond choosing to spare Yusuf in order for MI6 to have a window into Quantum's world, proving that Bond can indeed see the big picture rather than just going for small victories. But the actual bad guy and main plot of this film has little to do with Bond's personal journey. It's more getting back to business as usual, with Bond only having moments to think about Vesper. And when he has those moments, he doesn't say much. I don't feel like I have enough to latch on to feel Bond working through his emotions about Vesper's betrayal and death. I get that the film is supposed to be about Bond seeing humanity in Vesper's acts and not reducing it to summary judgments and cold hard facts. It shouldn't be, the bitch is dead. It should be, she made the best choice given her crappy situation and she really did care about me. But if that's what it is, I need Bond to actually talk about his feelings. He doesn't need to spout pages and pages of dialogue like what is in Hamlet, but we hardly get anything. Bond first dismisses the idea of revenge by saying Vesper wasn't important, which is a good start. But each subsequent time she comes up, he hardly says anything about how he feels about her, and what he does say gives us little evidence that there is a progression going on underneath. The ending has Bond throwing Vesper's necklace into the snow, which on its own is a beautiful way to close the movie. Sure, I love the acting between the performers in all of these moments, with Craig in particular doing a wonderful job. But there's only a vague outline of this emotional journey, nothing beyond hints between the great bookends. I think the emotional journey may have been clearer to Craig and the crew, but there is a big problem of communication in this movie. I don't need everything spelled out to the last detail, but I need more than this if the title of the film is Quantum of Solace, signifying that the most important aspect of the film's story is Bond's journey. I feel like I have a better handle on both Camille's backstory and Green's scheme than I do the main heart of this film. Now, you could make the argument that this approach of Bond saying little makes sense, since Bond is traditionally a very closed-off character and doesn't communicate his feelings often. And if this were Connery's or Moore's versions of the character, I would agree. But this is Craig's version of the character, a subset of films that supposedly have the emotional journey out front and center. In the last film, Bond clearly had moments where he could talk about his feelings, particularly with Vesper in the third act. In Skyfall, we feel the power of M's death because we know what she meant to Bond, even if you only had that film to go off of. And in No Time to Die, Craig has several wonderful moments where we get a clear picture of how he's feeling at key moments, like his personal reunion with Madeline, his conversation with Safin over his daughter, and his death scene. And even in classic Bond, we knew how Lazenby's Bond felt about Tracy without getting pages of dialogue from him. So I don't buy the argument of a closed-off Bond being the reason we never get a window into the character's head. I love the atmosphere of all of these Vesper scenes, but it's more smoke and mirrors to me than anything, reflections of something that isn't actually there for me to grab a hold of. I love the image, but that's all it is to me. Despite my feelings about Bond's arc as the script presents it, Daniel Craig continues to shine in this film. He has moments of charm, class, professional determination, danger, all of that. His chemistry with everyone feels just right. While Camille and Bond are not in the same class in, or even the same kind of relationship as the previous film, I love how the two play off of each other, and I could totally buy them sleeping with each other in another adventure. Bond still plays off well with both Mathis and Leiter, and the scenes with M continue to still be a highlight, even if I have questions about her part in the story here. Thankfully, this film avoids the sophomore pitfall of Golden Gun, where that film made Moore feel like an entirely different person to who he was in Live and Let Die. Craig's performance does feel in line with what he did in Royale, and thus Quantum continues to present us with a solid reinterpretation of Bond. Camille is one of my favorite things about this film. While I love the traditional Bond formula, sometimes I found myself wishing that we would have some variety in the relationships with the leading ladies. Does Bond have to sleep with all of them, regardless of their personal journeys inside those films, and even when I don't think their relationships are sexually charged? Does the needs of the formula mean that we can never do something else on occasion? Again, I fully believe these two would have gotten together in another film, but James and Camille are at precarious places in their lives at the moment, not really in a position for a romance or even to have downtime to have sex. It's great stuff. Plus, Camille having her own stories and goals is great. Instead of a female agent working the same case from the opposite end like we got in several of the past films, Camille is going after revenge against one of Green's associates. She is still an agent, but she has her own villain and is allowed to see her story through without someone else having to come in and resolve it for her, unlike what we saw in For Your Eyes Only. Instead of dreading her reappearance in the film because I feel like she's taking away from Bond's scenes, I look forward to her moments. The best one, of course, being the scene in the sinkhole. While I wish Bond had more here to say about Vesper, Olga Koryalenko gets a lot of work for her character done in a short amount of time, and it's enough. She makes for one of my favorite Bond women. Unfortunately, the villains of this film are a huge downgrade. I've never been that fascinated by Dominic Green. Much like Largo, he is an agent in an organization, not the true mastermind, and I like that sometimes Bond has to take down the lackeys first in their own stories. However, despite a solid actor like Matteo Amalric having some great acting choices in the part, Green is a load of nothing for me. He's not a mirror for Bond, he's no match physically, he's not interesting enough of a personality, and he does nothing to help facilitate Bond's personal arc with Vesper. He's just a step on the ladder towards the top, which in theory is fine, but it would be nice if he was an interesting step. Le Chiffre was very similar, but Mads Mikkelsen added a lot to make him intriguing and scary. Largo in Thunderball was ruthless and a decent mirror for Bond's character. I know the direction was decided to keep villains less cartoony in the Craig era, but you can still do lower energy villains that are memorable. Dr. No, Red Grant, Rosa Klebb, Necros, Scaramanga, and Drax are all good examples of this, and Green is just forgettable. Speaking of forgettable, that's also the word I'd use to describe both General Medrano and Elvis. Medrano at least has some color to him, and he feels more menacing of a presence than Green, but he's in the film so rarely and is ultimately a pawn of quantum schemes that his power and threat level are diminished. Elvis is an embarrassing example of a Bond henchman. He's got even less to his name than Green does. There's just no point in focusing on him because there's about as much to him as there was Hans in You Only Live Twice. Judi Dench's M is still great. The woman can really do no wrong with this part. But her role in the story is something that I have an issue with. Her trust in Bond has been shaken, and she is feeling pressure from her superiors and her conscience to rein Bond in. I love that Bond and M have a conflict, but that Bond doesn't see her as an antagonist. He's still professional with her, but also clearly has a personal admiration. I buy M's trust in Bond being called into question for precisely the reason she states to him in Sienna. But after the dressing down she gives him in the Bolivian hotel, she goes right back to trusting Bond without truly settling the question of whether or not he puts the mission before his feelings. Bond has one line about Field's bravery, and that's it. Really? After the whole thing about Bond being blinded by inconsolable rage, him killing most of the possible leads up to this point, and recklessly getting an office assistant killed in a gruesome fashion, one line resolves the issue? It comes off as really lazy writing to me. Also, I get that Judi Dench is a wonderful actress and you want to use her a lot, but I swear M has got just as big of a carbon footprint as any celebrity with the amount of air travel she does in this movie. This film has a solid collection of allies for Bond, though two of them are just past characters. Mathis gets about as much to do here as he had in Royale, and I love his and Bond's relationship. That said, I'm still confused about one thing. Bond had Mathis taken into custody based off of Le Chiffre's line about him. Here it's said that Mathis is innocent after having been tortured. I guess Vesper was the one that told Le Chiffre about the tell in the last film, and Le Chiffre may have name-dropped Mathis in order to cover for Vesper. Okay, but then I'm not sure that Bond admitting that he was wrong would be enough for anyone to overlook torture and decide to help him out. I don't know, it seems odd. Felix Leiter has an arc here about deciding to play along with the corrupt officials or to take the initiative like Bourne does and make things right. I do like this idea, but I also feel like it's a pretty flimsy justification to get him into this film. Obviously, Leiter is here because he was a great presence in the last film, and Bond needs an ally to tell him about Green's meeting with Medrano, but it still feels weak. Strawberry Fields is okay. She's clearly supposed to be reminiscent of past disposable Bond women, and she fulfills that part fine, but I don't think she has anything about her to make her stand out in that field. Lastly, Bill Tanner makes an unceremonious reappearance in the series for the first time in about a decade. Rory Kinnear is a fine choice for the part, and I'd recommend seeking out the Hollow Crowns adaptation of Richard II to see him in a meaty part. While he doesn't get much more to do than Villiers in the last film, I do remember Tanner more than I do Villiers. In case that character breakdown didn't make it clear for you, I think the script is pretty lazy in its construction and dialogue. I really don't want to harp on the actual writers or Forster and Craig for this, as a writer's strike prevented the script from being polished up. But I am going to blame the studio heads for wanting a film within 2 years and not making more allowances for the fact that a true sequel to Casino Royale needs time to be fleshed out. If the production had another year to work on the film, that would have helped immensely. And I feel like a sequel to Casino Royale would have done just as well financially in 2009 as it did in 2008. The goodwill built up by Royale was quite strong, and any interest would still be around for another few years, so I don't see that there would have been any harm in waiting around another year. But the writer's strike wasn't the only production issue hampering the film. Mark Forster is a fine director, and I've loved a lot of his work elsewhere, but I question the choice of bringing him onto the film. He wasn't a Bond fan and doesn't seem to fit the style of film. Quantum is ultimately an action film first and a personal story second. I get the hope was to flip that, as I think of Royale as the other way around, but the strike forced the filmmakers to focus on the action and general skeleton of the story over the dramatic weight. But that's more evidence as to why I think it was a mistake to fast-track the film for a 2008 release. Forster does know how to get good performances out of his cast, so I'll give him that. But it's hard to even let him have that because of his own decisions on the runtime and editing. Quantum of Solace is the shortest Bond film, and it feels even lighter on substance than it should because the editing gets in the way of the story being told. We're watching an interrogation and chase scene at the beginning, but the paleo horse race keeps getting intercut to spell out the obvious emotional progression of the scene. An MI6 briefing has little sense of cohesiveness because we can't keep track of where the players are in the next shot, and because there is little time to process the information dump being told. Action scenes often play out with little sense of geography, or to even give us a chance to see what is actually happening. It's exhausting trying to keep up with the film. Plus, there are shots that happen so quickly that they're easy to miss. For example, it wasn't until I saw one of Calvin Dyson's videos on the subject that I even registered the bullet impact on the rod next to M in this shot, and I have seen this film many times over the years. A lot of people have called the Craig Bond films discount Bourne films, and that's part of the reason why I did a whole retrospective on that series recently. I wanted to see if there was more merit to that argument than I had thought in the past. While I'll still disagree with that sentiment when we're talking about the other 4 Craig films, I wholeheartedly understand it when we're talking about Quantum. It features a protagonist who says little about his feelings while on a deeply emotional journey, shaky cam and quick editing, a hunt for the protagonist by government officials, very quick and efficient fighting moves by the protagonist, orchestral music with electronic elements, and the film even has some crew members that worked on that series, like Dan Bradley, the second unit director who was a stunt coordinator for Supremacy, Ultimatum, and Legacy, and Richard Pearson, one of the editors who did some of the editing on Supremacy. Some of these may just be coincidence, but I find it hard to argue that the shaky cam and editing weren't influenced by that series. But even if all of this is just a case of happenstance, it's not like the series hasn't done some trend hopping before. Moonraker with the science fiction elements, License to Kill with the gritty revenge story and drugs, Golden Gun with the martial arts, and so on. Bottom line, the shaky cam and editing get in the way of the presentation of the story and action. They don't immerse me in the scene like they did in Supremacy and Ultimatum. They hinder that immersion because the camera placement isn't as well thought out, and there's a lot of intercutting during scenes that, quite frankly, don't need these distractions. Despite being undermined a bit by the presentation, there are some fun action scenes. I love the opening car chase, the boat chase, and the opera scene, particularly with its brilliant use of Puccini's Tosca. However, I don't care for the Sienna chase, the fight with Slate, or the aerial dogfight bit. As silly as I think a hotel full of hydrogen cells is, I do like a lot of the action in the finale. There's a lot of give and take here. I love the interface and typeset of the MI6 board and titles, the titles themselves, and the suits made for Bond by Tom Ford. But I find a lot of the sets very standard, I'm not an especially big fan of the color correction, and I really dislike the title song. It's a strange amalgamation of a production. Regarding those titles, I miss Daniel Kleinman, and it's clear to me that these titles were not designed with the music in mind, but there are some solid ideas here. I love the use of the gun barrel dots throughout, the return of the women, and I'm actually glad these titles don't do water. A lot of previous Bond films have used water before, and while this film's central plot revolves around that element, it's supposed to be a reveal to us later, so featuring it here would be foreshadowing that wouldn't fit. Plus, using the sand to form the images of people and guns is a great substitute, as like with oil in The World Is Not Enough, sand will react and move differently than water. You still get the constant mixing and movement, but it'll look and feel different than before. The music is ultimately pretty good, with a big exception. This is David Arnold's last Bond film, and while this isn't his finest score, he does give us an interesting offering. It's still mostly orchestral with electronics, though those electronics are more present than before. The minimal use of the Bond theme drives me crazy, as it doesn't make as much sense. And some of the best moments of the score are when the Bond theme shows up. The final moments of the boat chase makes me want to cheer. The bit with Bond and Fields in the hotel has a great Barry-esque atmospheric use of the theme, much like what we had in Diamonds. Oil Fields, the track that plays when Bond escapes the Bolivian hotel, is one of the slickest pieces Arnold has ever composed. You get the point. I actually counted the instances in this film compared with Casino Royale, and I got at least double in quantum over Royale, though I wish it wasn't mostly just the 4-note progression again. The title song is a point of contention with people, and I'm mostly in the negative camp. I love the idea of a duet, and I think that either Jack White or Alicia Keys would have come up with a fine song on their own, but this is pretty bad. I can listen to it on occasion, but it's not one I find myself humming or anxious to re-listen to. It's in the same camp as Madonna's Die Another Day for me, and if it weren't for Never Say Never Again, I would struggle picking between the two as to which is the worst Bond title song. Any of the alternate choices feel like they would have worked better. Amy Winehouse would have done a fantastic job, but I understand why that didn't happen. There is a song by Eva Almer that is clearly a demo, but even as is, I would have liked it better. I do want to address a song that has come up often in regards to this film, the Shirley Bassey track No Good About Goodbye. Despite Arnold and Don Black having composed the song, the similarity of the main tune to sections of the Quantum score, and with even the lyrics matching so perfectly Bond's emotional state going so far as to even include the word Solace, the song was not written for the film, and all history points to it being created well after production was over. Despite this, those points I mentioned are too compelling to ignore. This is a case of life being stranger than fiction. Some minor observations. I love that the Walther PPK is reintroduced without fanfare. I love the P99, but yeah, the PPK is more iconic and is a better fit for Bond. When Camille is panicking in the fire, you can hear screams of her family members. That's a wonderful touch of sound design that adds a lot to the scene. The first time I saw this film, I didn't even register it didn't start with a gun barrel until we got to the end credits. It's nice that we still have yet to have an official Bond film without it, but this is one of my least favorite presentations of it. I kind of like the Fortet song that plays afterwards. Everyone makes fun of the sweeper that has his broom off the ground, and fair enough, but I was way more excited by the name on the Universal Exports card being R. Sterling. There are some fun bit parts in this film. A young David Harbour plays the corrupt Gregory Bean. You have your requisite Michael G. Wilson cameo in the Hotel de Saline. And the voices during the aerial dogfight are those of Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro. There's an inclusion of an Ian Fleming quote here by Mathis. His speech about the villains and the heroes getting mixed up was originally offered by Bond in the Casino Royale novel to Mathis while he was recovering from the torture scene. It's a bit awkward in this movie, but I love the exchange so much I don't mind including it here. Quantum of Solace is a real mixed bag for me. I think it's a thrilling ride, but it doesn't have the substance I would like. For everything I adore, there's something else that I don't. And the things that I don't tend to be more major in scope than the things I like. Sure, the production problems would have been hard for anyone to overcome, but they shouldn't have been able to kill the film by themselves. No, I blame the failures of this film due to a lack of cooking time. All the ingredients for a fine follow-up to Royale are here, and some of the elements even taste great. But put it all together, the meal isn't what the recipe claims it to be. I used to like Quantum a lot more, but it keeps dropping down with each new viewing for me. Doing this review series has more or less reaffirmed for me my feelings on the films as I set them forth in the Bond films ranking video I did a few years ago, with only a few moving up or down a space for me. This is the first one where I've had a more dramatic shift. I still wouldn't call it a bad film, as I find it very watchable, and I can think of other Bond films that commit worse mistakes than this. But even if you had never seen Casino Royale and could somehow follow this story fine, I think you'd still find it an odd experience given the reputation of the series. So Quantum of Solace didn't land with audiences as was hoped. Most were lukewarm to it at best, and it was certainly not the follow-up the studio wished for. Both the producers and Daniel Craig have admitted in interviews that the film doesn't work like it should have, and it was a transformative experience for them. Moving forward, it seemed like the filmmakers were going to be more careful with their productions, and with the untimely intervention of more financial troubles, it would take another 4 years for Bond to return to the screen, the stars aligning to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of the best and most influential movie series ever created in style.
Bond. James Bond.
– 2005 was a monumental year in film viewing for me. Thanks to my parents securing a DVR, I was able to expand my horizons and found many great and wonderful films I never had the opportunity to view before. However, I had 3 films that I wasn't sure what to make of on my first viewing: Jaws, Dr. Strangelove, and A Hard Day's Night. I knew these were iconic, but I was a bit put off because I wasn't sure what to expect going into them, so I was unprepared for their content. Thankfully, Jaws clicked with me on my second viewing. Dr. Strangelove has grown to be one of my most admired films, and the jury's still out on A Hard Day's Night. This is still an unusual experience for me, as I'm usually pretty quick in figuring out if a film is my cup of tea or not. That doesn't mean my feelings can't change over time, but I'm rarely left befuddled by a movie for too long. So what does this all have to do with Skyfall? Well, Skyfall is the one Bond film I've never been sure what my feelings are on it. It may help you to understand that I was unable to view this film until 2014 for several reasons, and so a lot of the perfect storm of circumstances that led to it grossing $1 billion at the box office was long gone by the time I saw it. I wasn't swept up in the patriotic British pride of the Olympics, I was 2 years removed from the 50th anniversary celebrations, and Spectre was just around the corner in starting up on its production and hype, so I was already looking forward to the next adventure before I got around to seeing this one. So it meant that the film had to win me over purely on its own merits, unaided by hype. And it did, just not to the degree I was hoping for. I knew this was a good film, but I still left my first viewing slightly disappointed. Thankfully, I knew better than to take a first viewing as gospel truth, and over the years, I've come to appreciate and admire Skyfall on a level like I have no other Bond film, even if it still misses out on being in my top 10 of the series. Work started in earnest on Bond 23 shortly after the release of Quantum of Solace. However, 2010 put a stop to pre-production efforts when MGM filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, meaning it was going to undergo reorganization in an effort to avoid closing. The strategy worked, and MGM reached another agreement with Sony, allowing for the production of both Bond 23 and 24. As to who the director would be, it was an easy choice. Daniel Craig reunited with his friend Sam Mendes at a party and brought up the topic. Mendes expressed interest and was immediately approved of by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. This was actually even before the bankruptcy, and he remained linked to the project right up through the actual production. It wasn't intentional, but the delays provided the filmmakers the opportunity to release a movie in 2012, coinciding with both the London Olympics and the 50th anniversary of the series. It seemed as though fate was on the side of Eon this time, as not only did they have an Oscar-winning director helming the film, but they were able to run through their wish list for this one. Javier Bardem, who had been talked about as far back as The World Is Not Enough, and had even been considered for the Halle Berry Jinx solo film, was finally signed on to play a villain. Albert Finney, a veteran actor whose film debut was in Harry Saltzman's The Entertainer, agreed to play a key part. Ralph Fiennes, a one-time contender for the role of Bond, would play Mallory, a bureaucrat who would have a larger role in the films to come. The film also provided the opportunity to reintroduce classic Bond elements like the gadgets, thus heralding the return of the Gadget Master, and M's secretary, Miss Moneypenny. The script, written by longtime collaborators Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, would be given a polish by Tony and Golden Globe-winning scribe John Logan. Most of the talented crew from the previous films would return, as well as being joined by renowned cinematographer Roger Deakins and composer Thomas Newman. For the 50th anniversary of the most influential movie series to date, it seemed like this one was in great hands, and only time would tell if it was a winner. During a mission to recover a stolen hard drive, James Bond is accidentally shot by a fellow agent on M's orders and is presumed dead. 3 months later, M is facing the consequences of that operation and Bond is living off the grid. A cyber attack results in the destruction of MI6's headquarters, and it is made clear that M's past has come back to haunt her. As soon as Bond is made aware of this, he promptly returns to London. But it is also evident that he has been shaken and is off his game, not fit for active service. Taking an ill-advised leap of faith, M sends Bond out to find the perpetrators of this attack, starting with the man who stole the hard drive and eventually leading to a disgraced and rage-filled former agent who wishes to prove a point about M's leadership and have the higher powers question their safety when their intelligence and security efforts are trusted to an aging handsome man in a tuxedo with a Walther. Skyfall has so many great elements that I love. It's a film that has grand ideas to ponder, fantastic performances, and a sense of groundedness that I usually go for. However, I felt as if it was bereft of either the visceral or bombastic thrills I wanted. It's not that the action or suspense scenes were bad, they just felt so low-key in their setup, and are shot in a way that makes me feel disconnected from a lot of them. I felt they were more appropriate for an Oscar-winning conspiracy thriller than a Bond film. Plus, I felt like the artistic sensibilities and goals of Sam Mendes were a bit heavy-handed, getting in the way of the escapist entertainment this series is known for, and that heritage is something this film is keenly aware of. Over the years, I've had quite the change of heart, but I still feel like I'm missing something. Let me make it clear. Some of my problems with this film that I'm about to go over are purely nitpicks or circumstantial issues, not really fundamental flaws that make me wonder how anyone could place this film at the top of their rankings. So don't take them personally if this is one of your very favorites. The first and most prominent issue I have with the film is how it follows on from Craig's first two outings. Forgive me, but I was under the assumption that after we closed off the origin story with Quantum that we'd be getting back to business as usual. I also had this same feeling when Casino Royale ended, but Quantum convinced me that it had to put the consequences of Vesper's betrayal to rest first before we could get back to that, so I made an exception. Skyfall is a really odd story to act as the third big screen Craig outing because one of its primary themes is that Bond is outdated and past his prime. It doesn't make sense to me within the context of Craig's tenure that we're already in a never say never again place with him. I understand this is more a meta-commentary on the series as a whole, and that maybe the assumption was that Craig went on several adventures that we hadn't seen, like perhaps he experienced some version of the other 20 films like the video game 007 Legends suggested. However, not only has some of that logic since been defeated by the existence of Spectre, but it's the same problem I have with The Dark Knight Rises. We had two films closely related to each other in themes and timeline placement, and then we make a dramatic leap forward towards the end of the man's career, acting like we've spent more time with him in his prime than we have. Because Spectre is a direct sequel to Skyfall and No Time to Die picks up just after Spectre, my understanding is that Casino Royale and Quantum are set in 2006. And then Skyfall is probably 2014 since Spectre is 2015, and the bulk of No Time to Die would be in 2020. That's a pretty big gap, and it feels really off-putting that suggests that Craig's Bond is past his prime in only his third on-screen outing, and especially since his second was essentially an extension of the first. Again, this is just a personal preference and nothing that's fundamentally wrong with the film, but I really question this choice. Maybe this is just a me thing and was a case of unrealistic expectations and flawed readings of the past two films, but I sure thought we'd be getting back to something more routine with Craig this time out. You can imagine how frustrated I was the first time watching Skyfall that it ended a Craig film for the third time in a row with a promise that we'd be getting back to a more standard adventure next time. The other problem I have is the choice of primary thematic substance. Determining Bond is still relevant is not only something that was tackled with Die Another Day, a film that just 10 years earlier served as the 40th anniversary celebration, but Casino Royale also arguably did this too, without making it an explicit subject just 6 years earlier. I know this series has a problem of repeating certain tropes and themes, but after GoldenEye, Die Another Day, and Casino Royale all tackled this question, a fourth film in 17 years circling around this same notion is starting to seem excessive, and like we're beating the nail further into the wood than it needs to go. It starts to make the character feel like a one-trick pony if his only universally acclaimed entries are just justifying his existence. Okay, now that I've addressed those 2 points, let me praise this film as much as my Bond fan heart will allow. Every time I've watched this, it has gotten better and better. And after listening to the director's commentary with Sam Mendes, I think I'm prepared to say this may be my second favorite Craig film, and is right alongside The Living Daylights on the edge of being in the top 10. That is quite the journey from where it started for me, and perhaps over time it may eventually earn a spot in the top 10. But I'm very happy to have come around on it a bit more now. In fact, this is the film I've rewatched the most in preparation for one of these videos. And that's because there was so much material I felt like I was sleeping on and had to digest that I had no idea where to start in writing this review. Let's begin with the film's structure. Mendes is keenly aware of the chances he is taking here, since unlike Mark Forster in the last film, he grew up a Bond fan and was very familiar with both the films and Ian Fleming's works. He starts the film with Bond symbolically dying. This is actually a trope that goes back to the early days of the series. From Russia with Love, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice all began with teasing the death of Bond, with Twice being the most explicit. However, Skyfall is the best version of this because it's not just a cheap thrill or part of the setup. It's an actual factor in the story that goes beyond the first few minutes. Bond must undergo a resurrection himself and regain the confidence of everyone around him, including himself. He fails the evaluations of MI6, the hedonistic lifestyle he indulges in does nothing to fulfill him, and he walks around in a zombie-like trance. It's not until he's made aware of a threat to England that he starts to reawaken. Bond's sense of duty has always been a key factor in the previous films, but here it's treated as the core of the character. It is his purpose. It is the thing that gives his life meaning since he has closed himself off to relationships and a family at this point, and it's perhaps the only thing that would snap him out of a self-indulgent lifestyle that many of us would love to have. It's something that proves the filmmakers have a keen understanding of Bond's character. Without that purpose, Bond merely exists, not gaining anything substantial from his party-like environment. A lot of parodies and casual audiences will focus on the refined lifestyle that seems like a vacation as key to the character. But what they fail to understand is that this is the window dressing of Bond's life, not a linchpin. This is a beat that is reinforced in No Time to Die. It's only when he has a mission to tackle that Bond comes alive again, despite always living in more exotic locations. M sends Bond on what is likely a suicidal mission based on Little Bit Faith, a nice harkening back to the novel The Man with the Golden Gun. By the way, I'm glad we've moved beyond the idea of M's unconfidence in Bond as a theme after Quantum. The problem becomes that Silva is more than a worthy match for Bond, and if you imagine a rogue Bond against MI6, he would make an amazing threat, much as GoldenEye proved. After the inquiry scene where Silva almost kills M, Bond takes her somewhere where he can dictate the terms of the engagement. Even though there aren't as many guns as he hoped for when he gets there, Bond can still have time to prepare the home against Silva's men. And yet the technology they have eventually gets taken away. All their traps are gone before Silva even arrives. He destroys the DB-5. Bond even destroys his family home to take out the helicopter, and eventually it all comes down to a knife which takes out Silva. With the death of M, the film needs a pick-me-up before we leave it, much as Star Trek II does with the image of Spock's coffin, or Casino Royale does with Bond finally uttering his most famous line. So the film ends with a celebration of the series' roots. Bond flirts with Moneypenny before being ushered into M's office where he receives a new mission, and then the gun barrel. Basically, the film ends with the reassuring elements that traditionally start a Bond adventure, signaling that he is finally back home and that all of the films that preceded it are part of cinematic history and have enriched it. Obviously, I still have the aforementioned problem that we still have yet to have a more classic Craig adventure, and thus we've now spent 3 films with Craig becoming something closer to the James Bond we all know and love. Yet confined to just this film, this is a wonderful way to emotionally re-energize the audience. We start with the death of Bond, have him reaffirm his place within our hearts, and then reward us with some of the coziest imagery from the earlier films. It's grin-inducing. For the longest time, most of my actual issues with the film revolved around the third act. It seems so in line with the rest of the film's action scenes, a more mundane setting, not featuring the big visual awesomeness we've come to expect from the series, and that the last 2 films continued to deliver. Basically, I never felt like the film was building towards something bigger, and that disappointed me on a thrill-seeking level. However, I've come around to appreciate how this finale thematically ties into the picture, and I'd be lying if I said nothing is interesting or exciting about this ending. Most of us have made fun of it for copying elements from Home Alone, with Sam Mendes even bringing it up on the commentary. The point is to show that Bond makes the best use of what little he has at his disposal, and there's something so satisfying in seeing both the initial setup of the traps and the payoff. Yes, I think Kevin McAllister somehow pulls this off in a more entertaining way than Bond does, but there are 2 observations about this climax that makes me appreciate it more. First, this is a climax that has a lot in common with old westerns, showcasing less of the fantastic technology in favor of putting the determination of the protagonist and antagonist against each other on display. It's a duel between the Titans over their faith in M and the mission. And second, Mendes consciously made the scene feel like it very well could have taken place in 1962, which is a cool way to acknowledge the longevity of the series. Mendes in this film seems very aware of the public expectations and likely future backlash he may receive surrounding the finished product, and I love that he does his best to sell us on his ideas without making apologies for them. Seeing Bond's home and acknowledging his past is a notion that many fans will not care for. Yet I love that Bond himself refuses to talk about the place in his past, keeping the details hidden from us, but making it crystal clear how he feels about it, culminating in a great one-liner before he blows the place up. Thus, Bond never tries to make a connection between the place and his past to what he's doing now, and I love that. His childhood died the day his parents died, and I love seeing their gravestones, by the way, and a new man emerged, one who would eventually grow up to be the hero we're following now. And Bond sacrifices the last vestige of his past, or so he thinks, to destroy Silva. Thus, finally, he can dedicate himself to the job at hand in protecting the world from devastating threats. Vesper was right in that M recognized Bond's past as being a reason why he could dedicate himself to king and country. And we see all throughout the movie that his self-admitted, pathetic love of country is what drives him to be the extraordinary hero that he is. And I'm inclined to think this was also true of the classic Bond as well. M's death is unfortunately an idea that does little for me. I love how it serves the film's themes and how we can feel the weight on Bond, but personally I never loved or hated the idea. Maybe it was because Craig's era is marked with an ongoing story arc and character development, so deaths of central characters wouldn't feel as out of place as they would have in the classic series. It could also be because I felt as though there would have to be a time we'd say goodbye to Judi Dench as the character, since she had actually played the role for as long as Bernard Lee had when he passed, so I was ready for the possibility. But quite honestly, I think it was because the death felt so telegraphed to me while watching the film for the first time. Thankfully, nobody spoiled M's fate for me in the 2 years it took for me to see the movie, But with Judi Dench's credit appearing in front of a grave, the bell tolling as M looked out the window with a sense of melancholy, Mallory's line about M having a great run, how the movie is all about death in a sense, how clearly we see M's bloody wounds in the lead up to the death, and the fact that we find M in an abandoned chapel next to a graveyard, it felt like the movie was flashing the death in neon lights to me, so I wasn't blindsided or unprepared for the moment. While I think the death is entirely appropriate for this story, it does not move me in the same way that Vesper's or Tracy's deaths have in the past. Skyfall is steeped in Ian Fleming. Each of the last 3 Craig films pulls from the later Fleming works, particularly unused elements of You Only Live Twice and The Man with the Golden Gun. What's interesting to me is that these are both novels whose film counterparts deviated wildly from their source material, making them more adaptations in name only in comparison to films like From Russia with Love or Majesty's Secret Service. These are also some of the less regarded Fleming works, and so it's reassuring to me that the creators are true fans of Fleming. They don't just stick to the famous books and take universally beloved elements, they mine what good ideas are left over from some of the weaker books, showing their appreciation for the author isn't diminished by public reception to those entries. And this film wonderfully captures the moody Bond, a version that isn't talked about as much with the public, partly because I suspect public knowledge of the book version is limited to Casino Royale, but one that is definitely there, particularly in You Only Live Twice. But perhaps even more impressive is the film's reverence for the movies that came before. It probably goes without saying that I think this serves as a much better celebration film than Die Another Day, and part of that is in the use of homages. Whereas Die Another Day felt like it couldn't go 2 minutes without throwing in another reference and making sure that each film was directly called out, Skyfall wisely chooses a few select films and works in the references more naturally. Goldfinger is the big one, what with the DB5 being the one from that adventure, You Must Be Joking, and the reintroduction of the tiny radio gadget. But I also noted direct callbacks or connections to GoldenEye in one of the film's funniest lines, License to Kill, Live and Let Die, and Casino Royale. I would also throw in 3 more films having less obvious connections. I've already covered Die Another Day's connections in the review for that film, so I won't repeat myself. Another is Dr. No, in that the villain operates off a deserted island and creates a mystique about himself that both inspires and terrifies his underlings, as well as featuring a bit of art that was missing at the time of filming. The final film is A View to a Kill. This may seem like a stretch, but hear me out. The villain is a blonde-haired former agent working against Bond. The madness is evident. His scheme involves technology as a key component. There is a competition of skill that the villain believes Bond will lose, and the villain dies in a less spectacular fashion. This may be mere coincidence, but I'd like to think it's deliberate, mostly because I'd love to think the filmmakers are respectful of the entire series. Love or hate some of the more maligned entries in the franchise, they are nevertheless part of the grand Bond tapestry that has been woven over the years. And I'm always more happy to see acceptance of the good and the bad over simply retconning or taking the mickey out of a panned work. This may just be wishful thinking on my part. Daniel Craig continues to shine in this film. It was a bit surprising at the time to see that unlike the other Bond actors, Craig plays the character differently in every entry, showcasing an evolving man, but it was a move I quickly grew to love. Bond's arc is defined by his faith in M and the mission. While he has presented solid evidence to disregard those things, particularly by Silva, Bond makes a conscious choice not to change. In character arcs, there is usually the opportunity for change, a time when the protagonist makes a pivotal decision in his journey, and we learn something about him based on that choice. I find a lot of heroes refuse to change, to give in to the madness and self-indulgence that the villain presents. This is a particularly great thing to do in this film, where we got a good glimpse earlier about what Bond would do with his life without the mission. So I appreciate even more why he chooses to go back into the service. This faith in M and the mission is also the reason why I'm fine with no main Bond woman in the vein of so many of the other films. Severine and Moneypenny provide us with all the sexiness we could want, and M's relationship is entirely different with Bond. While I would say she takes the position of main Bond woman in this outing, I like that each of the Craig films have a different relationship from each other. Vesper and Madeline represent the 2 great loves of his life, bookending it. Camille is a friend who helps him in his journey after Vesper's death, and M is more of a motherly figure who reminds him of the personal fulfillment he gets in his work. It's great stuff, and Craig plays the part wonderfully here, particularly nailing the subtle humor in the role and selling us the best he can with Bond's affection towards M. Judi Dench has been a treat in each of the 7 films she has appeared in. Her role has certainly morphed since GoldenEye, especially since the Craig films made a big push towards making her more than just the mission briefer. Skyfall gives us her finest work in the series. The film is just as much about M as it is about Bond, perhaps even more so since the catalyst for the film is M's mistakes, both past and present. I'm not sure I'd declare it Oscar-worthy, but it is the culmination of 17 years worth of work with the character, and it's the main reason that she's in the running for the best M in the series alongside Bernard Lee. It may also help that she quotes an amazing bit from Tennyson in the inquiry scene. The producers wanted to get Javier Bardem into the series for a while, and I'm so glad it was with this role. I was already aware of and impressed with Bardem based on his amazing work in No Country for Old Men, but much like Christopher Lee and Christopher Walken before him, he just walks into the film and instantly cements himself as one of the greats. I was initially put off by how close I felt he was to a Batman villain. The deliberate surrendering and capture bit did not help, but I quickly put that criticism to bed. I love that his scheme has more to do with M, but it also centers around Bond as well. I love Bardem's commitment to the part and his acting choices, and I love how he feels quite different to any of the main villains we've had in the past. Bardem describes him as an angel of death, someone who exudes grace and style, but who is rotting within. He also executes a standard villain cliche in the best way possible. Many times before, we've seen a villain ask the hero to join him, despite there being little reason given for why the hero might be persuaded by this offer. Silva is essentially offering the world to James after demonstrating that M is continuing to make foolhardy mistakes that could get him killed. And the extra spice that makes this great, Silva never comes out and says, "Join me." This feels like the best of the roles that Bardem could have landed in the series, and I'm so glad he stands as a shining example of villains within the Craig films, which is generally a subset of the series I think has a real problem with its villains. The reintroduction of Q and Moneypenny to the series was a long time coming and very welcome. Ben Whishaw is an inspired choice for the part of Q. He is quite different to dear old Desmond, but he makes a bigger impression than either Cleese or Burton. Thankfully, he's not copying what has been done before, but is instead presenting a new take on the role, much as Craig had done with Bond. He's a highlight in each of his 3 films, though I think his best work is here. I do question how likely it is that a tech genius like him would have allowed for the Trojan horse virus to penetrate MI6's security systems that allow for Silva's escape, but I'm willing to go with it, as Q and Bond's banter during the tube chase is my favorite part of that sequence. I'm less enthusiastic about Naomi Harris's Moneypenny, but I don't want it misconstrued that I dislike her. She's no Lois Maxwell, but she has the right relationship with Bond, keeping it a mystery whether or not they've had sex, but infusing the banter with a fun, flirtatious edge. I just think there are a few awkward bits with her, and while I like the idea that she thinks herself an equal to Bond in the field, she needs a reality check. Funnily enough, I was first introduced to Harris through After the Sunset, the film Pierce Brosnan was doing when he received the call that his tenure with Bond was done, and so I thought she was an interesting choice for the part. Like Whishaw, I'm glad she was kept on for the next 2 films, though her best work is here at the beginning. Ralph Fiennes is another great choice. I love that Fiennes' potential casting as Bond is acknowledged subtly through his backstory of being a field agent, but he admits field work is not for him. Fiennes knows how to keep the audience on the fence about him throughout the film until the end, and his introduction as the new M was a wonderful surprise to me. Mallory is a key part in the film, and in the hands of a less talented actor, this could have been an annoyingly botched character, but he makes for a wonderful addition to the cast and confirms the new Craig quartet of MI6 characters as a solid, recurring, and more active presence in the series. Speaking of which, it was a surprise to me that Rory Kinnear was kept on as Tanner after Quantum, but needless to say, I embraced this choice wholeheartedly. Severine is a great presence, nicely allowing for a more standard Bond woman who is more memorable than poor Strawberry Fields from the last film. Her scenes with Craig are suitably sexy and barbed-wired, each trying to get a read on the other. Her backstory of being in the sex trade does color the shower scene in an unflattering light, but I'm actually good with it because it's pretty clear to me that these are consenting adults, and besides, this is a Bond film. I really have nothing more to say about Patrice than what I've already offered in the Henchman ranking video. Finally, let's talk about Kincaid. His part as the loving but gruff mentor to Bond in his youth is just the right amount of revelation of Bond's backstory we need in the 3rd act. Side note, I'm really glad the decision was made to cast someone like Finney instead of bringing in Sean Connery as was suggested. This would have felt more like stunt casting and definitely would have taken away from Bond and M's story at the end. Also, it's interesting to note that Lee Tamahori also had a similar idea for Die Another Day, though he was going to bring in Connery as an older version of Bond, lending credence to the codename theory, so you can imagine how much I love that idea. Sam Mendes has a strong command of narrative and a solid understanding of both the classic Bond and the Craig interpretation, at least with this entry. And even if I might not agree on each of his inclinations, I highly respect what he's able to put together. In fact, he even improves on some things from previous films. For example, I found a lot of Dennis Gassner's sets for Quantum to be nothing special, but Mendes makes them work here. While I'm not an especially big fan of the Thomas Newman score, it's hard to imagine this film with a different sound. Mendes gets a great performance from just about everyone, and he knows how to build tension within a scene beautifully. I do think his action scenes are generally a step down on a thrill and spectacle level, but the downgrade in spectacle was a conscious move on Mendes' part. My highlights are the jellyfish sequence in Shanghai, the Inquiry shootout, and the finale at Skyfall. But the biggest area of improvement is in the cinematography, and that's because Mendes secured the services of one of our greatest living DPs, Sir Roger Deakins. My goodness, this film is a pleasure to look at. There are so many wonderful shots. The use of silhouettes borders on being as important a theme as anything in the script, and the camera is expertly placed in order to get the most out of every shot. This is a masterclass in visuals, and it is certainly Oscar-worthy. The only issue is that it came out the same year as Life of Pi, which is an incredibly well-photographed film. I generally love Daniel Kleinman's titles in this series, mostly for how different they are from each other and how tied into the films they are. Here, we take a novel approach by keeping the camera moving as if we are descending alongside Bond in the water. We also get quite a few unusual things here, such as seeing Bond both as a boy and then as a man, and generally keeping the naked women to a minimum. It's not my favorite, but it's a fine offering. As far as the music goes, my big problem with Newman's score is that I just don't find his original material that engaging or unique. When I was working on the Bourne retrospective, I had tracks from Skyfall as a temp score, and I wonder how many casual fans would have noticed if I just left them in. Newman has an increased offering of Bond theme over David Arnold's last two scores, but they still feel restrained, and I'm starting to get sick of it. Is it a crime now to just let the Bond theme loose in action scenes? Beyond those gripes, Newman does have some solid tracks. I love his track underneath the jellyfish sequence, the twanging Bond theme that plays at several points, like when Bond is pulling out the shrapnel from his body, the solemn horns that play as M's theme, and Bond's entrance into the Macau casino. As much as I would have liked a new version of the James Bond theme for the end credits, I understand Newman's thought process. Arnold did such a terrific job updating it for Casino Royale that all Newman felt he could do was compete with that. Then we have the Adele track. I adore this theme, though much like the film, I didn't have a strong reaction to it at first. It just felt like the title song that would have stepped out of the collective consciousness of fans. But that's also precisely why I've grown to love it. It takes most everything I've loved from past offerings and keeps it in a sultry package. Now, the general tune is perhaps a little more moody than most people would like from a Bond song, and the success of this song I feel is a direct influence on the direction taken for the next two films. I get it, Bond has become a little too morose at times with Craig's portrayal, and we'd like to return to something more fun. But I also have a soft spot for softer, dark, emotional songs, and so I'm a fan of all three of these. I don't think you're stupid for disliking three Oscar-winning songs that are a bit removed from some of the previous great Bond songs of the past. All I ask is that you don't think too harshly of those of us who really like these efforts. Let's end with the usual round of random observations, comments, and further nitpicks. I love the locations chosen here. London is certainly less glamorous than a lot of the others, but it makes sense for the 50th anniversary film. I'm always a fan of returning to Istanbul. Shanghai is a great choice. Love that we return to Macau as well. A nice connection to the man with the golden gun. And we finish in Scotland, which is a place that I've wondered why we've not visited in the past yet. The explosion of the DB5 was emotionally the hardest hitting bit of the movie for me. While I knew it would come back eventually, my heart broke seeing it destroyed like that. And like everyone else, I laughed way too hard at Craig's reaction with the aggressive Bond theme behind it. Of the films post The Living Daylights that have titles with no direct connection to Fleming, Skyfall is perhaps my favorite original title. It has the same sort of mystique and elegance as Moonraker, Diamonds Are Forever, and The Spy Who Loved Me. Want to know my 2 stupidest nitpicks in the whole series? I hate how short Bond's hair is in this one, and it's really distracting. Craig already has shorter than average hair in each of the other films, so I really hate the length here. Also, can we put a moratorium on the Storm's Coming lines in cinema for about a decade or so? I keep hearing this one crop up in many films, and I'm beyond sick of it. Skyfall is a film that I respect and appreciate more and more as time goes by. Much like Quantum, my viewings of it for the purposes of this review have shifted my evaluation of it a lot, though thankfully much more positively. The reasons for it not getting over the edge into the top 10 are basically how awkward it works as a third film in Craig's run, how it's trying to justify Bond's relevance in a modern world when we've already had 3 films in the last 6 that have done this previously, and because I think the artistic goals of the film get in the way of it being pure entertainment like much of the rest of the series. This is a film that both effortlessly showcases an adoration for the series, and yet at times feels like it's trying too hard to prove that Bond can play with the big boys. It does a lot of what it sets out to do extremely well, and I'm in awe of how this all fits together, but it doesn't quite belong in the upper tiers of the series for me. It's gone up quite a bit from where it started, and maybe someday it will break the barrier to belong in my group of favorites, but it hasn't quite yet. Skyfall proved to be a stunning success. The critical reviews were glowing, with several critics speculating if it was the best in the series. The film finally supplanted Thunderball as being the highest grossing movie of the series, adjusted for inflation. And it joined the likes of Goldfinger, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale as fondly remembered by casual audiences. With each successful entry, the producers faced the challenge of making a worthy follow-up. 2015 Spectre had quite the gauntlet thrown down in front of it, and it was a history-making film as well. But the 4th film in an actor's tenure is rarely considered by the majority as one of the better ones. But that's not going to stop Eon from expanding on the world of Bond to deliver an adventure with its roots squarely in the glory days of the past.
Bond. James Bond.
In one of the final scenes in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the titular character offers this response to his wife's death. Within his pessimism, he laments how life's actions are ultimately hollow and meaningless despite their grandeur. Beyond poking a bit of fun at how pretentiously Spectre opens with a bit of text, I chose this phrase to start the review because that last bit, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing, is perhaps a stronger description than I would use, but nevertheless is fairly accurate in representing how I feel about this film. Spectre frustrates the living daylights out of me because I think it fails at almost everything it's trying to do. Normally, I can turn my brain off and just enjoy the spectacle of a Bond film. But when it is part of Daniel Craig's story-heavy tenure and features the long-awaited return of Spectre, I can't ignore its larger ambitions. I will, of course, have more than a few nice things to say about the film towards the end. No Bond film is without merit has been my mantra for these reviews, and I stand by that. However, there will be a few entries where I will come across very negative despite my best efforts, and I feel obliged to warn you up front that this will likely be one of those. The legal troubles that surround the character of Ernst Stavro Blofeld and his villainous organization have long been a standing issue with the series, and I've touched upon them several times already in past reviews. As is tradition, I'll pick up from where we last left off. After Never Say Never Again's release in 1983, Kevin McClory still felt like he had unfinished business, despite succeeding in producing his own version of Thunderball. Throughout the 80s and into the 2000s, Kevin pursued a few different avenues, such as a failed animated series in 1988, recycling his Warhead script from the 70s with a potential leading man in Pierce Brosnan set in Australia, and producing a live-action TV show in 1992. After the failed attempt with Sony that would have featured either Timothy Dalton or Liam Neeson as Bond in the late 90s, there was no major traction seen from McClory until he died in 2006, around the time of Casino Royale's release. In 2013, McClory's heirs sold these rights to Eon, finally allowing the makers of the official James Bond films to have these characters and elements back under their roof. So it was no surprise that the very next film would be partly sold on their return, since it would mark the end to the decades-long war. With the massive success of Skyfall, the future was positively bright for James Bond. The franchise was at an all-time high, both critically and commercially, so it was only natural that Eon wanted to secure as much of the creative team as possible that had done such a good job. Sam Mendes was reluctant to come back, as not only was his schedule pretty busy for the coming year, but he felt as though he had exhausted all his good ideas on Skyfall. The producers had learned their lessons several times about rushing into another film prematurely, so they agreed to wait and do a couple of other projects in the meantime, including releasing Eon's first non-Bond film since 1963. Whether intentional or not, enough time had passed that Mendes became available again. Despite several other directors' names being tossed around, I think the producers had their hearts set on Sam with writer John Logan. The duo worked together on a number of ideas, all featuring the return of Blofeld and Spectre. There were quite a few experiments, such as featuring Bill Tanner as a traitor at MI6, switching the gender of Blofeld, making M the villain, and even exploring the idea of shooting 2 Bond films at once, though it sounds like Craig was the one that put the kibosh on that. Despite Logan's work, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade were brought in yet again to work on the script, as it was reported that the core group wasn't happy. And Jez Butterworth, thanks to his previous uncredited contributions to Skyfall, was brought on as a 4th writer. With another fantastic cast coming together, including some terrific names like Christoph Waltz playing the villain Oberhauser, and Monica Bellucci finally getting to play a Bond girl after missing out in 1997, the 24th Bond film was announced in December 2014 as Spectre, and seemed like it was going to be another monumental outing for the super spy. Having received a video message from the deceased M, James Bond goes off on his own to hunt down a man called Marco Sciarra in Mexico City. The ensuing confrontation causes severe property damage, prompting the current M to officially ground Bond on his return to London. The Secret Service is undergoing a merger and is being brought together with a number of other global secret services under the watchful eye of Max Denby, who is pushing to scrap the 00 section. Determined to follow up on a lead from Sciarra, Bond heads to Rome to attend his funeral, where he rediscovers someone who he long thought dead at the head of an organization called Spectre, of which many of Bond's past villains were a part of. He hears them talking about an enemy of theirs, the Pale King, who is revealed to be Mr. White. Upon their reunion, Mr. White reveals to Bond that he is willing to give him information on Spectre in exchange for vowing to protect his daughter. Except Madeline Swan has no interest in Bond's help or being dragged back into the life of espionage. With Mallory facing political pressure at home and Bond out in the field hunting down Spectre, is there a chance that this man from the past will finish his crusade against 007 and the forces of good? When I finished Spectre for the first time in theaters, I gave up on my hope that a traditional Bond film with Daniel Craig would be coming. It was clear to me that the series was not interested in returning to that style at the time, and that was disappointing. While I understand that Craig and each director wanted to get something unique out of the films so that they didn't lose interest in the project halfway through and consider it a chore, I look at Roger Moore and marvel that he didn't feel the need to do that for his 12 years. And despite the inconsistency in quality in his films, he was almost always fun to watch, and each gave me something awesome that I looked forward to revisiting. Despite some intriguing elements, Spectre has several big strikes against it. On a pure petty and fanboyish level, it's not fun to watch for most of its bloated runtime. But more importantly, it sets up some goals for itself, and I feel like it fails at each of them. Now, fair warning, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this next part. The film wants to return to a more traditional style of Bond films, using the Connery era, Live and Let Die, and The Living Daylights as its guides. And with the addition of Spectre and Blofeld again, this should be easy, right? But here comes the first problem. Spectre both wants to be more traditional and have campier things like Blofeld and Spectre, and yet it's unwilling to move on from Craig's first 3 films' established tone. So right away, the movie squanders Spectre and Blofeld because it has to remove some of the more campy aspects to these concepts so that they can work within Craig's world. Instead of progressing the films to a point where a shadowy figure with a white cap might feel right at home with this version of Bond, the filmmakers generify them and rob them of all their color, which is a similar mistake that Never Say Never Again made with the group. If you're just going to do a more grounded Illuminati-esque group, what's the point in calling them Spectre beyond marketing the film? If I have to take away Superman's unyielding sense of optimism and prevent the audience from seeing him fly or be in a colorful suit in order to make him work in a more realistic world, it's starting to feel like I'm embarrassed about doing Superman in the first place. Same here. If the pressure of the fact that Austin Powers has poked fun at my most famous villain means I have to water him down so that he can work in a more straight Craig film, then I shouldn't do Blofeld at all. The second goal of the film is to tie all of the previous entries together and make it one larger story. It does this okay with Casino Royale and Quantum, but making Silva and Patrice part of the organization, as well as implying the death of Judi Dench's M was somehow part of Blofeld's revenge, feels too far. That film was so singular with its story, much like Goldfinger was during the Connery run, and I have an easier time buying Silva as a rogue agent and Patrice as a mercenary than that they too took orders from the same man. Spectre already has enough to tie it into Skyfall, Bond's past, Judi Dench's M reaching from beyond the grave, and the returning MI6 characters. Why do we need to force that film's villains and story into a retroactive development step towards this film? It feels like Spectre has an inflated sense of self-importance, and it's weird that it feels the need to do this because the fact that we have Spectre and Blofeld back in the official series should already be big enough. It comes off as a kid trying to make the playground story grander for the sake of the adventure. At some point, it becomes egotistical and leaves a bad taste. The third goal is to set up Bond's next great love in Madeleine Swann. Léa Seydoux is a fine actress, but boy, this character doesn't work for me. She and Craig don't have enough chemistry to make their scenes interesting to watch. I don't ever get the sense that they are into each other until the dinner scene on the train, and it's not too long afterwards that Bond and Swann will both be making claims of love to each other. There's an interesting idea that the daughter of a villain might be the only one to understand Bond and his work, but not only is it weird that it's Mr. White's daughter, but there is no exploration of this idea because Madeleine refuses to discuss it with Bond or accept that she can't escape being dragged back into this life. It leaves me so cold to the character that it feels unfair to put her in the same emotional area as Tracy and Vesper. If it weren't for No Time to Die's corrections, Swann would be my least favorite Bond woman of them all, and that's saying something. The fourth goal is to get Bond to consider a life beyond MI6. Right away, this is an idea that I resist because Skyfall just spent 2 hours reaffirming that Bond's place is in the service. What justifies the next film into going into this point now? We still have yet to see Craig doing more grunt work-like adventures on the big screen like we see in the video games Bloodstone and the GoldenEye remake, so it feels like we're just doing the big moments of the story rather than showing us the ride. It's like doing the story of Ray Charles without showing his drug addiction and personal woes. His triumph over those things and the success of his career only carries weight if it comes after spending time with him during those struggles. Those moments might seem less important in the grand scheme, but what people fail to understand is that they are the building blocks of the structure. Just showing the highlights and leaving out all the in-between stuff is cheating your audience. Remove the day-to-day stories in favor of just showing the big moments, and we lose the heart of the story. Same with Craig's Bond going to retirement in his fourth movie. You can't just say, well, you've had 20 more traditional adventures in the series, just insert them in between the films we're doing now. Because A, this is a new timeline that paves over the older adventures, and this film doubles down on that notion by introducing a new version of Spectre Blofeld, so a good chunk of those movies can't be included here anyway. And B, Reducing a character's journey to only the big moments is removing a lot of the meat from the meal. Can you imagine a Lord of the Rings adaptation where we spent no time developing the Fellowship characters and we just jumped ahead to Mount Doom and the big battles? What if we did a version of Hamlet where we spent no time with Hamlet discussing his feelings about Claudius and why he wants revenge, and we just skipped to the second half of the story? What if we just killed Superman in his second movie without focusing on his smaller feats of heroism and getting us to be inspired by him first? Just because part of a series isn't directly tied into the progression of the ongoing story doesn't mean it isn't serving a deeper purpose. The fifth and final goal is to be a thrilling action piece. As you can guess by now, this film really struggles even handling that, in my opinion. Aside from the pre-credits, all of the other action scenes feel lackluster and tame. I don't mind more grounded visions for action, but there needs to be some payoff in each of the scenes on a thrill level for them to work. The Rome car chase is a good example. It's too restricted. There's no great stunts, the drivers hardly interact with each other, and there's no real progression to the action itself. It starts as a car chase without offensive gadgets, but it gets interrupted with Bond calling Moneypenny to get an info dump, which means most of the action in the chase is unimportant. After the call, the chase can finally do a couple of cool things, but by this point we've spent so much time with Hinks chasing Bond that it's too little too late. Compare this to any of the other great car chases in the series. Each of them focuses on the actual action happening in front of our eyes. They also have something that changes the situation, feature a great stunt, or have elements of danger and urgency throughout. This chase has little of that, so it's a big disappointment given how much we were looking forward to seeing the DB-10 in action. On a side note, I understand that part of this problem was exacerbated by Italian officials. They didn't want to see their beloved city destroyed, so they limited what the filmmakers could do. I can sympathize with that. But then you need to rewrite the scene. Either pull a Skyfall and have the chase move outside of the city, or end the chase quickly and have Bond and Hinks confront each other in some other way. Shootout, punch up, game of cat and mouse, I don't know, something. I guess I just feel that Sam Mendes has real trouble when it comes to the action in his films. I don't think I've ever seen as big of a drop in quality between a director's first and second Bond film. Some went up in quality, like Terrence Young went from Dr. No to From Russia with Love, or Lewis Gilbert from You Only Live Twice to The Spy Who Loved Me. Some did experience a downgrade, like Guy Hamilton from Goldfinger to Diamonds, and arguably John Glenn from For Your Eyes Only to Octopussy. But here the downgrade is rather marked because I'm scratching my head more. How can the same man who made Skyfall, a film that proved for me that it had a great respect for both the literary and cinematic 007, as well as pulling off a thoughtful story, suddenly make a follow-up that has little understanding about the series' past and a story that commits some grave errors? Maybe Mendes should have listened to his first instincts and stayed away from this one if he had to generate interest for himself to return. The foundations of the story makes for a flawed construction project in my eyes. Bond being the ringleader of MI6, a group that actually has less experience than he does in the field, is not interesting to me, mostly because it makes Bond feel more like Ethan Hunt than anything. M having to battle bureaucracy at home justifying the existence of the 00 program is an idea that worked before in the last film. But here, it feels like spinning wheels in order to make the movie seem more important and relevant on a thematic level. Bond finding love again is fine, but I've already addressed why that doesn't work here. However, the biggest piece of criticism I've seen levied against the film is with Blofeld. Christoph Waltz is a wonderful actor, exactly the kind I would have gotten for the part, but tying him into Bond's past was a terrible move. It feels too comic booky. Blofeld would be most everyone's pick for Bond's arch-enemy, but not because they're essentially brothers. It's because it's a battle that we've seen fought across multiple films, and then the position of arch-enemy was cemented with Tracy's death. The adopted brothers angle feels like a contrived way to make this villain the most central to Bond's life, despite others striking deeper wounds in previous Craig films. But what's worse is how Blofeld describes his motivations. He likens it to a cuckoo bird building its home in the nest of another, which was apparently an idea from Michael G. Wilson. The way it comes across is that this is an immature boyhood feud that lingered. Bond needed to be raised by some people after his parents' death, and because his own dad loved the other child more and spent more time with him over a few years than his actual son, Blofeld is going to dedicate his entire life not only to killing his dad for depriving him of love and attention, because, Families with multiple children are guaranteed to raise supervillains for focusing on the more needy children in lieu of teaching the others how to ski, but destroying Bond as well, with the reformation and manipulation of governments being a bonus. This is not compelling material. It's inane and a lame justification for Blofeld's machinations. Somehow, the protagonist and antagonist having no shared background was way more interesting and exhilarating than making them family. But even beyond my issues with the goals of this film and the basic story skeleton, there's more than enough things to take issue with. This film feels like it takes all of its 2.5 hours to get through because virtually every scene is played with such low energy by the performers. Sometimes that works, like in the scene with Mr. White building a fine tension, but most of the time it feels drawn out because the audience isn't sharing in the tension or intrigue of the scene. The Spectre meeting room has several moments where nothing is happening, because we are waiting to see what Blofeld or someone else will say, more so to break the silence than to punctuate the drama. The scene with Blofeld and Bond at the former MI6 headquarters is devoid of resonance because neither actor feel like they have an emotion building underneath. The scenes with Andrew Scott C feel pointless because it's a foregone conclusion that he's a villain that will be thwarted and the 00 section will not be going away, regardless if Bond stays with MI6. In my view, this film is wasting time because it's assuming I'm more with it than I am, and that's a problem because it hasn't presented me with the right things to get on board with its story, themes, or actions. It's not even like I can enjoy the main actor's performances. Craig feels like he's sleepwalking through the film. Sado is too cold and reserved for me to want to bond with her character. Waltz has no dimension to his villainy and is no fun to watch, and all of the good side performers feel like they're passed over too quickly. Monica Bellucci is a terrific choice, but her character is discarded within 5 minutes. Jesper Christensen gives his best performance as Mr. White here, but once again, it's over too quickly. And Hinks doesn't get nearly enough time to pay off his potential. The cinematography is generally good, with Christopher Nolan veteran Hoyt van Hoytma returning to film stock here, though I really dislike the color correction. It's far too brown for my tastes. Bond finally getting back the DB5 is a great idea for the ending. But because I don't buy into the relationship, I'm not thrilled about Bond quitting the service to run off with Swan. Plus, they are still using the David Arnold version of the Bond theme as end credits music. Now it's coming off as scared laziness here, Newman. Just try a different arrangement or recording of the theme, for goodness sake. And I know you can, given that I adore some of your versions of the theme for this film, and despite your score's constant reuse of the material from Skyfall. A small nitpick I have is with the film's marketing. Though it was widely known that the film was going to feature the return of Spectre as an organization, a ruse was kept up that Waltz was going to play Oberhauser and there was no acknowledgement of Blofeld. This seems stupid to me. How is the reveal that Blofeld is in a film revolving around Spectre an actual reveal you want to keep from audiences? Those that know what those things are will have already figured it out long before they see the film, and those that don't won't care. I do have a question. When Bond meets Q at the clinic, he tells him to examine the Spectre ring. Through DNA analysis, Q confirms that Oberhauser is alive. Then he makes the claim that almost all of Bond's past villains are a part of the same group. I get some of them, but how does he know that Silva and Patrice are a part of Spectre? Did I miss something? Shall we spend some time with the parts of the film that I think really work? It has far more misses for me, but there are some genuinely good things here. The pre-title sequence is a strong opening. The continuous opening shot is terrific and filled with the right mixture of intrigue, danger, and cool. The moment when Bond hops onto the balcony and the atmospheric Bond theme plays is goosebumps-inducing. The fight in the helicopter isn't my favorite in the series, but it's a wonderfully well choreographed and paced action scene, with plenty of things in common with the best of the series. This is the sequence out of the entire Craig era that feels the most like classic Bond to me. And while I'm fine with the newer flavor of Craig's Bond for the most part, it got my hopes up that I was finally about to get my wish for a more traditional film. Sadly, that wasn't to be. I know I'm in the minority, but I really like Sam Smith's song, more so musically than because of his performance. True, it's a slower, more melancholy song than we've had in the series up to now, but I think it's quite powerful in parts and matches the moodiness of Craig's Bond this time out. I can't defend Smith's performance, though I think it matches the emotions of the song. I think the titles are actually an improvement over Skyfall's. I adore the menacing octopus and the use of the tentacles and a lot of the imagery, like the multiple eyes around Bond, the skeletal hands that appear in front of the Spectre agents, and Blofeld's head being a mixture of the skull and octopus. The one issue I have is with the reuse of images from past Bond films. I know why they're here, but I just don't care for the idea. This film continues the series' great streak of locations. Rome is a city I always felt Bond should have gone to at some point. And as a side note, I wrote a fan script for a Bond film once that had a good chunk of the action feature in Rome. Mexico City is a fine choice, complete with the Day of the Dead celebration. There's something very Thunderball and Moonraker about this whole sequence, taking a chance to highlight the culture as part of the larger atmosphere. It shares a couple of locations in common with the Living Daylights, Snowbound, Austria, and Tangiers. It then ends in London, which I guess is fine. The extra thing I like about the Tangiers Morocco setting is that Blofeld's lair is in an area called Gara Medwar. Beyond evoking the imagery of You Only Live Twice's lair, this is an area that was first used in the 1999 version of The Mummy. I take issue with the use of the MI6 characters in the story, though each of them does fantastic work. Mallory calling Bond on the carpet for his actions in Mexico City is fantastic. Moneypenny's scenes with Bond have some decent interplay, with the added awesomeness of seeing Bond's sparsely decorated residence. I can't tell you how giddy I was to see a proper Q branch scene here, and I think it's mostly excellent, with Q laughing at his own joke being really funny to me. Q getting out into the field is fun, though definitely forced. There's a shot with Donna Lucia that's so good, and it's the bit with her going out into the darkness with the assassins behind her. Plus, the following scene is one of my favorites from the film. Craig feels the most like classic Bond here, with several of the lines feeling like they could have come out of Connery's mouth. Even if I don't love the chase sequence, I love the cars in Rome. I adore the costuming in this film. Bond's white tux is excellent, as is Madeleine's dress. Blofeld's suit has a very Dr. No vibe about it. This film, like Skyfall, has a lot of references to past Bond films and stories that are hard to miss. Two of my favorites are the elevator in Mexico City being the same one from License to Kill, and the safe house being the Hildebrand Prince and Rarities. In addition to being a nod to one of the best Fleming short stories, this place was established in 1953, the same year Casino Royale was published. Spectre is a strong candidate for my least favorite official Bond film. After a spectacular opening 15 minutes, I find it dreadfully dull for most of the runtime, facepalm-inducing towards the last half hour, and only punctuated with a few brief solid scenes. Generally, after a great pre-title sequence, you want a Bond film to slope upwards in excitement and momentum. This film goes the opposite way, tripping after the first half hour and spiraling down the mountain until it lands in the bushes. The good things that are in the film either make the experience worse because they give me hope, or are forgotten about so quickly it's like they never happened. Despite my harsh criticism of the film, it's nowhere near the worst movie I've ever seen, but within the excellent series it's a part of, it forms the bottom of the barrel. It is still a Bond film, but one with so little uniquely interesting or captivating on its own. I've said before that the biggest error a film within a series can make is when its high points are things that other entries have done better. Virtually everything in this film has been topped somewhere else in the series. There are better pre-title sequences, better Blofelds, better concentration of action scenes, better true love interests for Bond, better gadgetless sequences, better uses of the MI6 characters, and better Craig Bond performances. If this film wasn't a part of the Bond series, I doubt I would even be motivated to regularly rewatch it, much less own it. And I know I'm not alone in this viewpoint. Spectre is often placed towards the bottom of a lot of ranking lists, despite several films having a worse critical reputation. Bottom line, my first Bond film in the theaters after 7 years was a dud, and I sincerely hope that Craig wouldn't end his tenure with this one. It would take another 6 years before the next Bond film would be released in cinemas, though not entirely because of the lengthy production timeline. Despite the press making a fuss about an out-of-context interview claiming he had no interest in returning to the role, Daniel Craig signed on for a 5th film, making it crystal clear that it would be his last. Unlike the other official Bond actor finales, the filmmakers were determined to make Bond 25 with that as its focal point both in the story and marketing. This was an unprecedented move for Bond, and would lead to the longest and boldest film in the series' 60-year history.
Bond. James Bond.
I should have known I live alone. Was I stupid to love you? Was I reckless to help? Was it obvious to everybody else that I've fallen for that?
There's an emerging trend I've seen with the media in recent years. The notion itself is not a new one, and certainly not within James Bond. But I've seen a lot of examples of films, shows, video games, and the like that are positively reviewed by the masses, but the core group of fans tends to be more mixed, and some are very vocal about their outrage. There are a number of possible reasons and theories as to why this could be happening, ranging from companies alienating their fan base in an attempt to get wider audiences into something, to reviewers being so-called shills, to wider audiences' quality standards lowering over time, to the rise of toxic fans. Whatever you believe is the cause of this, I personally think a lot of the criticism towards these products tends to be overblown and exaggerated. Not that it's baseless exactly, but that the rise of the internet has led to criticism becoming louder and more prominent than it used to be, and it's not always just about the relative quality of a piece. In the 3 years since the release of No Time to Die, I've seen a lot of fans peg it as their least favorite film in the series, and that's not surprising given the story choices it makes. However, I've also seen a lot of those same people label it as unwatchable and the worst film they've ever seen. That's quite damning, and while I can understand some of the resistance to this film, I'd never go that far. I don't tend to label things masterpieces or garbage on a whim, as those terms are thrown out far too casually these days, and I'm not very quick to say something is without merit or flaw after a single viewing. If a film is said to be the bottom of the barrel of cinema, I'm expecting something along the lines of Son of the Mask, Meet the Spartans, Master of Disguise, The Last Airbender, and the animated Titanic films. And however awful some Bond films are made out to be, none of them have ever come close to those depths for me. No Time to Die's production actually started up soon after the release of Spectre, and a version of the story was conceived by 2017. Yet once again, MGM had to find a co-producing partner as the deal with Sony wrapped up upon the release of Spectre. Several companies expressed interest, but ultimately it was Universal that made the cut. In 2018, Danny Boyle was revealed to be the director of Bond 25, and his concept was chosen instead of the previous one. From what I can gather, it was set in Russia and would explore some of Bond's origins. A few months before production was to begin in late 2018, Boyle left due to creative differences, and so the story needed to be recrafted, though some elements would be kept, like Bond having a child, which was actually an idea taken straight from Ian Fleming. The duo of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade took another crack at the story, with uncredited help from Paul Haggis and Scott C. Burns. In April 2019, Daniel Craig requested a rewrite and polish by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, making her the second credited female writer on a Bond film after Joanna Harwood. New director Cary Joji Fukunaga also contributed enough ideas to get story credit for the film as well. Bond 25 was announced as No Time to Die in August 2019 and was set for an April 2020 release date. However, as you can very well guess/remember, No Time to Die became the first major production to have its release date affected by the COVID pandemic, and so the movie got pushed back several times, eventually releasing in the fall of 2021. The film marks the end of Daniel Craig's tenure with the role, and even though he's only made 5 films, the continuous length of his run is longer than any previous actor by a few years. Unfortunately, despite general positive reception, the box office for the film suffered as a result of the pandemic, and the movie is still considered to be one of the most divisive amongst the fan base. James Bond, having retired from MI6, is off with Madeleine Swan enjoying their new relationship. Some months in, the couple find themselves in Matera, Italy, where Vesper Lind is buried. Madeleine asks Bond to visit Vesper's grave and put the past to rest. He does so, only to have the grave blown up in his face by Spectre. Blofeld calls the couple, implying that Madeleine is responsible for leading Spectre to them, thus prompting Bond to leave her on an outbound train and end their relationship. 5 years later, a biological weapon is stolen by Spectre from London. Felix Leiter, perturbed by how neither the US or Britain are talking to each other about this, tracks Bond down to Jamaica to ask for his help in finding the scientist responsible for the weapon. He initially refuses, but decides to accept after the new 007, Nomi, meets with him and warns him not to interfere. Bond soon finds that there is a third party involved in this matter, using the weapon to both target Spectre and throw the world into chaos. Despite having no professional obligation to continue the fight, Bond decides that he can't ignore the call to action and chooses to defend the world one last time. No Time to Die is many things. Ambitious, risky, unprecedented, uniquely tailored to an actor like no other film, both a Bond film rooted in the past and being one of the most removed from the classic identity of the series. Such a film is bound to be polarizing, as the execution of such a grand production is often flawed, as are most films. Some of the risks taken are ones that certain fans are dead set against, while others are ones that can win people over with the right amount of care. I can't possibly speak for anyone but myself when addressing these many creative choices, so don't be surprised if you find yourself in stark disagreement with my assessment of these things. As long as we can discuss the film without making the debate a bloody battle, I can totally understand if any one or all of these choices make the film one of your least favorites. For me, I find No Time to Die to be a very entertaining film for most of the runtime. Flawed in the culmination of its objectives and story points, but nevertheless is peppered with ideas that I think work and scenes that make me grin. In short, this doesn't feel like a traditional Bond film by any means, but it generally elicits the same feelings I get from watching most any film in the series. There are thrilling moments throughout, moments that make me laugh and smile, fun characters and performances, and a sense of grand escapist fun built within the product. However, the film progresses into quite a downer of an ending, and with several lingering questions and contrivances that threaten to spoil the meal. Sometimes I can just go with it and well up in emotion at Bond's death. At others, I feel very little while watching the ending. Yet I never want to throw out the entire meal because the last act is compromised, especially in this case. I've had 2 hours and 30 minutes of a wild ride, accompanied by a less than stellar villain and some 15 minutes that crumble apart when you breathe on it. But this is nothing new with a lot of films for me, and so I'm a little baffled by No Time's standing within the fandom. Much like Spectre, I want to address my major criticisms before tackling my positives. The most prominent feature of the film is that it ends with the death of James Bond, the first time that's been depicted in an Eon film. I've seen criticism both about the very idea of it and the execution, with even continuation author Anthony Horowitz voicing his dissatisfaction. Personally, I don't have a problem with the idea, as long as we are talking about the Craig version of the character. For a few years, I was more rigid in what a Bond film had to include in order to be a Bond film. But with the arrival of Casino Royale in 2006, I had to come to terms with the fact that a lot of my preconceptions actually didn't matter, and that multiple flavors of Bond were fine with me, much as I can accept different interpretations of Batman. I would argue that killing Bond for good with someone like Sean Connery or Pierce Brosnan in the role would be inappropriate, much as it would be to kill off Adam West. Those films had such a fantasy and bedtime story makeup to their world. Much like the first two Indiana Jones films, the hero always wins, he never grows or changes beyond individual films, he always gets the girl at the end, and everything is tied up so neatly. Granted, there were experiments like On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but even there, killing off Bond would not have fit that story. However, Daniel Craig's era is marked with character progression. He is not a stagnant being, and the films do build on top of each other. He has an acknowledged past, and the films have major characters die. So why would I expect that this Bond is exempt from the eternal sleep? Because the films very clearly signaled a separation from the earlier style, I had an easier time with the breaking of conventions and traditions with Daniel, including that of the certainty of the hero surviving. If you prefer the earlier style, not to worry, I do as well, but I'm not about to let my preferences determine so resolutely that I cannot accept, like, or give certain things the benefit of the doubt. If that were true, I would have missed out on some great Regency-era romance films or crude rated R comedies. I can understand the criticism about the handling of the death more readily. In theory, there's a lot of things I like about it. I like that he doesn't just die by some gunshot or stabbing. I like that it's presented as a sacrifice for the greater good, a far more noble and heroic kind of death. And I like that it isn't treated as a national day of mourning. It's marked with a small gathering, with only Moneypenny and a few tearful colleagues in attendance. That said, my biggest problem with the death is that it feels like Bond is backed into a corner and has no way out. There is no option of escape. Bond is forced to die. While the film tries to present the death as a choice Bond makes, it doesn't feel like it. Bond is shot and given no time to escape the island. And then there's the obvious complication of the eternal nanobots and their poison, making it impossible to reunite with the one thing that would mean the world to him. All avenues of hope are closed off so resolutely, and Bond is trapped without even the hint of such a virtue. It's not a heroic sacrifice, it's a resignation to fate, and this feels wrong to me. James Bond is one of the greatest cinematic heroes. He deserves something better. In this case, a choice. If Bond is going to die, I think a heroic sacrifice is a fine way to go, but with the added plot complications and how hopeless the situation is depicted, it's unsuitable for this version of Bond. Never mind how awful a fit it would be for any of the other actors. To sum up, certain versions of Bond dying is fine. Any version of Bond being so defeated in his final hour is unacceptable. The second major issue I have is with Safin. Rami Malek is another solid choice of an actor, but this is my least favorite official Bond villain. I like the comparison that can be made between him and a vampire, a monster who transfers living death through blood and that has an obsession with a woman. And Malek has a few good acting moments, but for the life of me, I feel like I'm on quicksand trying to understand him beyond that. I can get with why he goes after Spectre and the Heracles weapon, but we are given so little to go on about how his obsession with Madeline fits into his larger vision, why he wants Bond's daughter on the island but is also perfectly fine with letting her roam free, why he wants to target the world with a virus but also sell the nanobots, why he wants to be an invisible god telling the people what to do, or if even any of these things are connected or if they're meant to be separate motivations. He could just be a guy with a god complex and an obsession with Madeline. But then certain bits of dialogue try to suggest that there's something deeper to him, that he's breaking stereotypes about Bond villains. This doesn't read as a captivating mystery, it comes off as though the film is being inconsistent about him. Ideas don't mean anything if there is a lack of solid communication within the film about them. The No mask is a perfect encapsulation of this villain. He is neutral, with almost nothing really to go off of, and so we can read into him whatever we want. I further question why the film wants to portray him as such, or why this was even seen as the right kind of villain to get to seal off Bond's fate. Out of all of the great, clearly defined villains we've had in the past, some of them cinematic icons in their own right, how come a mystery villain with very little concrete about him gets the distinction of defeating Bond permanently? If we have nothing solid to latch onto with this guy, then he becomes an amoebic character that is somehow supposed to be a match for a well-defined character that verges on being the perfect embodiment of a cinematic archetype. I think this specifically is why I dislike the character so much. I'd still have a problem since I find his motivations and goals borderline incomprehensible, but the lack of justification about him getting this particularly unique accolade pushes him further down in my estimation. The third issue is the amount of contrivances. I touched upon this a bit in talking about Bond's death, but let me elaborate. Contrivances are standard in storytelling because sometimes writers need a band-aid to connect things together. It's not the most ideal tool in an arsenal as it creates things like plot holes and stretches in logic, but it can do in a pinch, and if the story is entertaining enough to justify the use of the contrivance, I'm not going to care much. Virtually no movie I've ever seen hasn't had at least one contrivance. However, if the contrivance is a thing central to the plot, it's harder to overlook. The nanobots being eternal is something you'd have to work hard to sell me on, and this movie just merely states it as a fact twice and moves on. If the virus is something that builds its way into your DNA through nanobots, I would assume that means the tech side is key to the survival and transfer of the weapon. With Q being a tech genius, I could maybe be led to believe that he would require a lot of time to figure out how to destroy a micro-sized machine, but I do not buy him saying the threat is permanent. Viruses can be killed, machines can be broken, and DNA can be changed. And if they keep him in complete isolation until they find a solution, I think Bond could go along with that as long as he gets to have a life afterwards. I think the switch from a strictly DNA-dependent virus to one aided by nanobots during production was a detriment, but I would still question why the poison is eternal or why some kind of protection can't be manufactured. Moving on from the poison, the countdown on the island is a little perplexing. Okay, there are some buyers coming in for the virus, so I grant that MI6 is on the clock, but surely they have more time than 9 minutes. The boats don't even start to make landfall when the missiles hit. We aren't told that the missiles can't be aborted, and I would assume there would need to be some time to transfer the virus from the island to the ships once they arrive. But even if the buyers somehow got the virus, we know that it has to be programmed with a set of DNA before it can work. I would assume Safin leaves the programming to the buyers themselves, but even if that isn't the case, if MI6 can't launch missiles directly at the buyers for some political reason, I do have a solution. Nomi is a 00 with a license to kill. Why can't she be ordered to intercept the boats, shoot all the people, and then sink the boats without touching the virus? Also, why isn't the idea of Nomi staying behind on the island and destroying the base brought up? Is there a story reason in-universe it has to be Bond? I just think there are several ways that we could solve this problem so that Bond doesn't have to die. But this film just asks you to take what it presents as irrefutable truth and leaves no room for questions or speculation. That's frustrating to me because I really do enjoy the rest of this film, but the final 20 minutes threatens to make me put the whole thing down even lower in my rankings. The other problems I have are smaller, and I'll address them as I spend some time going over the things I like about the film. As I've said, I find it to be incredibly entertaining, and at one point would have even considered it my second favorite film of the Craig era. Let's start with the man himself. Daniel Craig hasn't given a performance that feels exactly like his previous efforts, and I've enjoyed seeing how he's transformed from the young 00 in Royale to the retired man in Jamaica. I think my favorite performance of his is still his first, but my goodness, Craig pulls out all the stops here. He wonderfully shows Bond having a good time with Felix and Paloma, making jokes with Q and Nomi, getting frustrated and rageful with Blofeld, being defeated with Safin, and regretful about his choices regarding Madeline. He's still not the most chatty of characters, but each scene with him makes the emotions crystal clear through the combination of the writing, performance choices, and the reactions of everyone around him. This may not be his best, but I would consider it one of my favorite performances I've ever seen from Craig. It helps that the actor has a greater say on the direction of his films than his predecessors, with the exception of Connery with Never Say Never Again. But I can't imagine any other actor doing as fantastic a job as Daniel in this film. Bravo. In the last film, Léa Seydoux made for one of my least favorite Bond women. She still has some of those traits here that frustrated me there, but that makes sense. As much as I didn't care for the initial characterizations of the players in the first Spider-Man film with Sam Raimi, it wouldn't have made sense for sequels to have abandoned those depictions. Those characters were set, and what a good storyteller should do is make use of what they have moving forward and tell stories that feel appropriate. In fact, Spider-Man 2 actually uses the flaws of the characters to its advantage and tells a great story about them. This film is not in that same league, but it does something similar. In Spectre, I disliked Madeline not wanting to talk to Bond about her desire to keep away from the dirty business he engages in at all costs. But here, the desire makes much more sense now that she has a daughter. Plus, the daughter helps to justify why Madeline plays everything so close to the chest and being even less chatty than Bond is. In the pre-credits, Seydoux and Craig go a long way towards selling me on a relationship I disliked previously. And the scene with the two of them at the Norway house is one of my favorite quieter scenes from any Bond film since The Living Daylights. Finally, I love how Madeline rescues herself on Safin's island, putting into practice all that talk of her being a survivor that we saw little evidence of in Spectre. Madeline is still one of my least favorite leading ladies in the series, but this film does elevate her quite a bit. I've already talked about Safin, but I haven't covered the solid group of henchmen he has. Primo has some character to him, and I buy him being a physical match for Bond. I've heard some people saying his switch from Spectre to Safin makes no sense, but he is a mercenary for hire. He has no true loyalty to Spectre beyond the money, and once that organization is gone, I think it makes perfect sense for him to jump ship. There's something about Billy Magnuson's Logan Ash that I adore. There's a quirky giddiness about him that makes me love to hate him. The quip Bond has about his original stiff portrayal in Jamaica is right on the money, and I love watching him crop back up through the film. He gets to kill lighter, and his death was justified karma that evokes the great death scene with Locke from For Your Eyes Only. David Densing's Valdo Oberchev is my least favorite of the three, but there's something very campy about him that makes him stand out. He has a few moments that feel stupid, but there are others where he's a fun, nasty bit of work. He goes back and forth for me, but compared to the rather drab assortment of henchmen Craig had in the first three films, he is an improvement. Lashana Lynch's Nomi was a big talking point with audiences, and this is a character you either love or hate. The chip on her shoulder and the arrogance she has towards Bond can be tough to swallow, especially since she enjoys to flaunt the 00 number in front of him. However, I think what helps sugarcoat the pill is that Bond gives just as good as he gets. He enjoys showing her that he can still match and even surpass her. Yet, he is the one to offer an olive branch first after being rehired at MI6, and from there on we see her slowly warm up to James. Her offering him back the 007 number felt too fan-servicey to me, because of course Bond needs to go out as 007 in his final mission, right? But I like where she gets to by the end of her arc, and seeing two 00 operatives on a mission together is a treat. I think overall she's a real asset to the film, but I don't begrudge anyone who feels like she hasn't quite earned her redemption by the end. Also, I kinda hate how the media latched on to Lynch's casting and started to write clickbait articles about how Bond could become a female-led franchise in the future. Nomi and Bond both say it within the film. 007 is just a number within the world of the series, and there's no real reason why Bond's designation has to be that number except to us as fans. Treating fan expectations and demands as determining factors on the characters and their stories is almost always an unwinnable battle to me. So I was perfectly fine with her being the new 007 within universe. But of the three Bond women in the film, the only one that seems to have been universally accepted by fans is Ana de Armas's Paloma. And the acceptance is for good reason. She's so much fun. A woman who is incredibly nervous and only has 3 weeks of training kicking all kinds of ass is a recipe for entertainment. In fact, the whole Cuba sequence is one of my favorite action scenes in all of Bond, partly because neither Bond nor Paloma are infusing it with a standard one-upsmanship. That position has already been filled in this movie, thank you. They are just two people helping out each other and seem to be enjoying each other's company. If anything, I think the sequence is the blueprint for what I would like to see going forward in the series, and I too am bummed that she is out of the film so quickly. That said, she very well could have felt like an unneeded addendum and overstayed her welcome had she continued with Bond for the rest of the film. She is my favorite of the three women, and definitely a highlight of the entire Craig era. Impressive given that she's only in the film for 12 minutes. The MI6 characters are reliable in their presence. Q has some predictably great moments here. I like Moneypenny's role here more than I did in Spectre, and while Bill Tanner feels unnecessary, I appreciate him being here if only for continuity's sake. M is the part I'm most conflicted on. Ralph Fiennes turns in another great performance, but his role in the story is a bit awkward. M being key to developing the virus feels misguided, as I can't help but see it as an obviously flawed decision. He claims he did it for the protection of the country and that it was never intended as a weapon of mass destruction. However, I don't buy that this possibility never crossed his mind, given that Oberchev was a defector to the West and that any weapon can be turned around and used for evil. I also take issue with his saying that he owns up to the responsibility of the weapon, given that he refuses to talk to other nations about it and even dodges the Prime Minister's calls throughout. It's not that I think M can never make questionable choices. Judi Dench's M certainly did in both the Brosnan and Craig eras, but I think this is something that's out of character for Mallory. After sitting out on the last two films, Jeffrey Wright becomes the only Felix Leiter actor to have appeared in more than 2 entries, and it's a real treat. He feels far more chummy with Bond here than he ever has before, and I like that Bond has a real friend. Wright is an amazing actor who has been excellent in everything I've ever seen him in, and he and Craig completely sell me on the idea of the two being like brothers. His going outside the service to reach out to Bond feels just right for a man who saw Bond go outside his own service during the events in Quantum, and it's sad that Leiter doesn't survive the mission. On the one hand, part of me wishes he had gone to Cuba with Bond, but on the other, it means we would have lost out on Paloma, so I can live with how it is now. His floating away like Vesper is so haunting, and I love that it gives Bond a personal reason to see the investigation through. Finally, this film features the return of Christoph Waltz's Blofeld. I had a lot of issues with him in Spectre, but as with Madeline, the film takes the pieces it has and runs with them. Blofeld loves messing with James, and seems to understand him on such a personal level that he knows exactly what buttons to push. His confession to screwing with James during the pre-titles is both something I buy and effective at making me hate him. A lot of people have commented that Bond's reaction to Madeline in the pre-credits feels a bit too easy, but I buy it because A, Vesper, B, if Blofeld is the author of all of Bond's pain and essentially family, I love that he would know that Bond might be triggered by the seeming betrayal of another loved one, and C, I love what it says about Blofeld. Bond's problem in Quantum of Solace was that he was too quick to judgment and reducing things to raw facts without humanization. He seems to realize that treating Madeleine completely as an enemy is the wrong way to act, but he would have a hard time not starting to shut down again on some level. Blofeld's deception in the pre-credits feels wonderfully heartbreaking because James is being punished for being so quick to throw Madeleine away. Because he reacts on instinct, he is robbed of the years of happiness he could have had with her, and so he himself might be the reason he never found peace, because he runs without looking. This is an idea that Casino Royale was centered on, and while I love that it seems that Bond has learned his lesson about trusting people there, he may have overcompensated and built his defenses so high that he may never have allowed himself to be in a position to have a family. And this feels far more devious of Blofeld than anything depicted in Spectre, using his understanding of James's psychology to get him to torture himself more than Blofeld ever could. Again, an impressive job done on a character with minimal screen time. Cary Joji Fukunaga does a fine job building off the previous 3 directors while having a lot of the same sensibilities. The story comes first and the action second. However, unlike Forster and Mendes, he seems to have no trouble with the action. For the first time since Royale, I felt as though the action was both exciting and easy to follow. As I've said before, the Cuba sequence is excellent, but the pre-titles are also amazingly well done. After featuring a horrific and suspenseful sequence that reminded me a lot of both From Russia with Love and The Man with the Golden Gun, he gives us an amazing car chase through the streets of Matera. This chase deserves a special nod for being the first time since Goldfinger that we've both seen the DB5 in a proper car chase and using its gadgets at the same time. The bit with Bond spinning the car in place and using the machine guns and smokescreen brings a smile to my face every time. I also enjoyed the sequence in Norway. The car chase is okay, but it's the second half where we move into the forest and Bond has to fight off the remaining pursuers that gets me going. There's such an atmosphere to this bit, and I love Bond using his skills to take out each person without a gadget up his sleeve, reminiscent of the 80s John Glenn films. The finale with Bond and Nomi also features some great action, particularly Bond going up the stairs in a sequence dominated by a continuous single shot. I'm so relieved that for his final Bond film, Craig gets another solid action piece. There are also some great story touches that I love throughout. Bond visiting Vesper's grave was unneeded, but the emotion in the scene really got me. Bond not knowing how to deal with being a dad is a wonderful thing to see. And Bond's relationship with Q is filled with some great bits, ranging from Bond's face in the office to his quip about the cats. I think Fukunaga seems to be very good at balancing the larger needs of the story with the action most of the time, the ending of course being the exception. One of the main focuses of the Craig era seems to be duty. All heroes need to have some drive and determination, else they aren't proactive and the story gains no traction. James Bond, being one of the great cinematic heroes, needs something noble at his core despite being a debonair bastard, and it seems to be a compulsive need to answer the call to action. Not for personal gain or glory, but because he's a patriotic soldier. He often does this in a very cold manner, seemingly detached from all emotions. In No Time to Die, he is faced with 2 reasons to continue investigating Heracles, though it's not until a ways in that defending loved ones will even come into play. It's initially the defense of the civilized world that brings him out of his artificial paradise that is trapped beyond time, which is true to the spirit of the classic character. In fact, the novel You Only Live Twice, upon which this movie draws heavily from, plays on this same notion, that Bond's higher call to service is what brings him out of his self-imposed exile. In this way, it makes perfect sense to draw connections to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is also about Bond pursuing a mission out of professional duty, regardless whether he was actually assigned to the case or not. He then gains an added personal reason to see this job through to the end, and while he does succeed in the greater mission, there is quite a heavy personal blow waiting for him at the end. I do think the film goes a little overboard with some of these connections, but out of all of the previous films to reference for a grand finale, that's the one that makes the most sense to me. Every Craig film is filled with references of the past, and some are more overt than others. Here, the second most obvious connection is made with Dr. No, with the dots in the titles, the choice to place the finale on a secluded island with a mysterious villain who is called Doctor, the design of Safin's lair, and Bond's criticism of Safin being an angry little man reminds me of Bond's line about madmen in that first film. On that note, the Doctor line feels out of place because no one else calls him that throughout the movie, and we have no reason to suspect that Safin is a doctor of any kind. I'm one of the fans that believe Safin was intended to be a reinterpretation of Dr. No at some point, but I'm glad they retooled him later, even if it partly results in what we have now. Another film that No Time to Die references is The Living Daylights. I adore that instead of another DB5 that Bond drives out of the garage in London, he drives a V8 Vantage, proving that other eras of Bond are still fondly remembered. There is also a quick cameo of a painting of Robert Brown, the M of the 80s. Given that both Judi Dench and Bernard Lee have also had some portraits, it's nice to see Brown receive some recognition. The music here is mostly return to form. I wasn't terribly impressed with either of the Thomas Newman scores, and I was incredibly nervous about Zimmer infiltrating the series with his trademark tendencies. But I felt as though he tailored his style fairly well to the picture. Like Michael Kamen before him, Zimmer has one foot in the rock and roll world, making for a very heavy and melodic score that is also keenly aware of the legacy created by John Barry. I love that he brings bombastic screeching horns and a heavy guitar into the action scenes, making up for some of the more muted uses of the Bond theme in the past two films. The thumping of the main theme in several scenes injects adrenaline directly into my system. There is also lovely integration of the softer themes, which is very effective. Eilish's title song is given the right amount of heartbreak when used, and Zimmer does his best to integrate past themes into the score. His Vesper theme reuse is the highlight, and I actually like the Majesty's main theme reprise. The major problem I have is with the reuse of We Have All the Time in the World. It's an exploitative use of the song, and it feels weird to use it over a different relationship than Bond and Tracy. It's part of the film's attempts to make you buy into the romance, and it's actually the main thing that keeps me from fully getting on board with it. Shame. Overall, much like the majority of the film, Zimmer brings back some of the campy fun I missed in previous Craig outings, and I was wrong to be so doubtful. The Billie Eilish song is a contentious offering. It's by far the most downbeat and slowest of the catalog. Coming after two more melancholy tracks, it does feel a bit disappointing on the first few listens, and it has the added complication of being fully an Eilish-style track. If you hate her muted singing, then the song will not work for you. Me, though, I've made it pretty clear in the past that I'm fine with the more soulful tracks of the Craig films, and I think when paired with the right song, Eilish's vocal style can make for a great marriage. Hence why I really groove with the song and think it's another great addition to the lineup. I do want to return to the earlier style of songs eventually, but so far, I've been good with the songs that have come along. There are plenty of other moments that range from great to confusing. I love the gun barrel being at the beginning and the lack of blood that helps to transition us to Norway, but I do dislike the gunshot itself, partly because it's a stock sound that I've used in projects years before the film came out. The titles are an interesting experiment from Daniel Kleinman. As per usual, they're uniquely tailored to the film, and I love the thematic idea of time corroding the monuments and the icons of the series, though there's something about it that keeps me from fully embracing it. Maybe it's the combination with the song. I do love it, but the titles feel grander than the song calls for. I think I might have preferred a quieter, more muted, contemplative sequence if we're going to go with this song, much like what we saw in For Your Eyes Only. The whole thing feels a bit too opulent for me. This film is still very serious and somber in places, but I would say the tongue-in-cheek humor and camp has increased from past films. Valdo Oberchev almost feels like he belongs in something like Diamonds Are Forever. The magnet elevator and nanobots feel like they could have been part of the tech-heavy Brosnan era. Both the Bionic Eye and Qdar would feel very silly in something like Royale, but after Spectre refused to embrace the camp of some of its concepts, these kinds of things are very welcome to see again in the series. Bond has more than a few quips here. I particularly think the "blew his mind" line is directly from the Roger Moore Handbook of Jokes. But that's not to say it's all fun and games. I've mentioned the Vesper Graves sequence before, but that whole bit has a perfect cocktail of emotion. Blofeld's reveal is terrific with a great sense of anticipation. I love Bond breaking Safin's arm at the end. That might just stem from a desire to see this villain end in a lot of pain. I also adore Bond just shooting him in the face so dismissively. So let me throw out a few questions I have. Can someone explain to me the game that Felix and Bond are playing in the club? It makes no sense to me. I get Madeleine keeping her child hidden, but how in the world did MI6 miss her being pregnant when they were checking her out? Or does M know and is just keeping it buried for some reason? I think Madeleine's line to Bond about Mathilde not being his is meant to be, I don't want her to be a part of your life. But it's easy to misconstrue that line as being, she's not physically your daughter. It should have been made clearer, as it took me several viewings before I thought it meant something else. What's with that bit in the car with the mosquito? Is that supposed to be foreshadowing how Safin is an insect that uses blood to infect people? It's really odd in its placement, and it feels like it's unnecessarily taking away focus from the action in the scene. No Time to Die is not for everyone, and I'm a little baffled by some of the major story choices in it. As early as the pre-production of Quantum of Solace, Daniel Craig put forth the idea of killing off Bond in his final film. Given that Craig is a clear reboot from those that came before, I think this is an idea that has potential. However, the actual death leaves a lot to be desired. The main villain and his goals are far too murky for me to be satisfied, and the ways in which the film manufactures its final minutes are perplexing in their logic. Yet the movie also wonderfully remembers to have fun at times, and it's peppered with great action scenes, solid supporting characters, and a fantastic Craig performance. It is by no means a perfect ending to this actor's reign, though then again that seems to be par for the course in the series, but it's a little sad that it doesn't fully stick the landing here. But for all my problems with it, I still enjoy No Time to Die immensely and would happily rewatch it over and over again. I do think it serves as a decent example of both what the series should and should not do going forward, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next. Unfortunately, there has been little word about that next step at the time of this recording. Eon has been very quiet about its progress on Bond 26 and casting a Bond 7, if they have bothered to make a move at all. This is heartbreaking because the Craig era marked an increase in delay between films, so it feels like Bond fans have not had that much to cheer about since 2006, apart from the sporadic film releases. The period between Spectre and No Time to Die was originally supposed to be 4 years, but with the COVID pandemic and production setbacks, it increased to 6, matching the gap between License to Kill and GoldenEye. What makes it harder to bear is that this film was completed in early 2020, so we had a year and a half of waiting before we could see anything beyond promotional material. We are now over 3 years since the film's release, meaning it looks like the franchise will be taking its biggest hibernation before the next film. The in-between period of actors is always an uncomfortable space to be in, as there's usually speculation and dread that the series will not make good on the standing promise that James Bond will return. I'm holding out hope, though it's proving to be a long winter of discontent for Bond fans. The most controversial of all of the Bond actors, Daniel Craig embarked on an experimentation that few of us seem to believe in, and one that was even harder to pull off. A more human, realistic leading man in a series that still retained its high-octane action and tongue-in-cheek humor. For a large group of die-hard fans, it's argued that he never succeeded in his desires, despite his popularity with casual audiences. Craig wanted to bring back a sense of realism and depth to the series, though that seemed to come at the cost of breaking traditions and removing series staples. For some, the series became devoid of fun, mirroring only the conventions of modern action cinema and felt nothing like the films of old that remain near and dear to our hearts. I think it's a shame that people feel like this because not only do I not share this viewpoint, but much like Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan, I feel Craig needs more recognition and respect for what he did with the series. As with those two actors, Daniel resurrected the series from near certain death and brought with him a renewed enthusiasm. Arguably, he had the hardest job of all because the films of old seemed to be relegated to the delusions of parody in the spy genre. Die Another Day was one of the most outlandish of the series, and not only did it come out the same year as the third Austin Powers film, but it was also written by the writers of a later parody, Johnny English, and directed by a man who would go on to direct a pale imitation of the series. Thankfully, Craig had an impressive start. In his review of Casino Royale, the legendary Roger Ebert said the film, quote, has the answers to all my complaints about the 45-year-old James Bond series. All 5 previous Bond actors praised him highly, with Connery calling him marvelous in the part, Lazenby becoming convinced, Moore being impressed so greatly, Dalton lauding him as terrific, and Brosnan having the greatest admiration for Craig. The course of the films after Royale was not without speed bumps and questionable creative decisions, but I do think the filmmakers were making a sincere attempt to explore new territory and keep the series from becoming creatively bankrupt. Craig was certainly a departure from what came before, and some are going to object to that on principle. These things are always subject to taste and personal preferences that often have less to do with the quality of the films themselves alone. Even if you could pull off a musical comedy about 9/11, I'd still be a little uncomfortable. So I can sympathize with the resistance to Craig's take, but I do not believe this means we can never take chances with the series. And however I feel about the individual films themselves, Craig was a Bond that took chances. I do think the films poke a bit of fun at the movies of old, but nevertheless can show that they have an immense adoration for them as well. I'm very excited to see what comes next, and I can only hope that the next Bond will take the lead from Craig. Not in that he has to model his films after Craig's tone, but that he should be a Bond that breaks new ground and strives to be the best he can be. Daniel Craig ruffled some feathers, and as with all risks, it didn't always pay off. But I applaud that he didn't want to coast and instead sought to reaffirm James Bond's position at the forefront of action cinema in any way he could. And that cements him as a positive addition to the franchise in my book.